Chapter 181. Fall into a Trap. The Lord of the Five-Rayed Heavenly Host, a Space Marine's soul, slipped into the mind of a mind-controlled mortal, shielded by the psychic guard of 20 brothers. His consciousness plunged into a void, an absolute, featureless black where there should have been the color and warmth of human feeling. A mortal's soul should be alive with shifting emotions and memories. This one was blank, its darkness cut through by countless thin white filaments. At first they looked like cracks, but they were threads of white awareness woven like a spiderweb through the void, anchoring and steering every flicker of thought. Where those strands met, a single pale mote of light floated, innocent, pure, harmless in appearance. He reached out with a tendril of awareness and brushed it. The moment his consciousness touched that mote, Xeno-knowledge slammed into his mind. He had risked everything to probe the psyche of the Xenos and seize whatever intelligence he could, and now that forbidden torrent began to pour through. He pierced the surface of the Randan mind and saw its architecture. A vast base of controlled slaves, a middle layer of elite warriors, and at the apex, the war leaders. He even glimpsed fragments of Morse's deployments. Morse had prepared for humanity. The Randan had been expecting them. The whole thing was a carefully laid trap. The Lord of the Heavenly Host sank his consciousness deeper, hungry for more. Who was touching his mind, he wondered. Before he could answer, a violent psychic shock hit him. The white, spiderweb filaments of his own probe contracted with a snap, flinging back toward his consciousness as if they had become a noose. A tide of mental pressure surged up from the dark, and the filaments stiffened into ropes that coiled around him. For years he had been probing other minds. Never had he felt anything like this. The presence was far stronger than an Astartes, brazen, aggressive, dominating. Horror flared through him at the realization. Still, he did not panic. He was an Astartes, and his mind was shielded by the Brotherhood. He compressed his consciousness into a razor-sharp spike and drove it at the pale orb of light, intent on shredding the Xeno's mind. A raw cry tore out, a violent psychic backlash erupted, and the orb splintered into a web of irreparable fractures. At the same instant, more information flooded his thoughts. He, the Lord of the Five-Mang Heavenly Army, parsed it at once. The Randan, a xenospecies famed for their psychic might, could dominate races whose psychic strength was weaker. Their control was absolute and irreversible, seizing both mind and body. Randan brains were unusually large to support those powers, and they secreted a unique cerebral fluid as part of that physiology. To themselves, it was a consumable, an everyday cleansing agent, produced and expelled constantly. But the fluid had a far darker purpose. If another species ingested even the slightest trace, it would poison their minds, forge a psychic tether to its owner, and allow the Randan to take command. "Human, you will get nothing from me," the Randan spat. The moment their minds met, the Xenos realized the intruder was a human. The faint white point of light quivered, fractured like glass, and dissolved into the surrounding dark of the psychic space. As the Xenos' psyche pulled back, the human's inner world collapsed with it. There was no saving him. In the physical realm, his body detonated, erupting into a cloud of blood mist. The Lord of the Five Heavenly Army, consciousness snapping back into his flesh, flinched and muttered, "We're in deep trouble." Cold sweat beaded on his forehead as he fought off the after-effects of astral projection. He motioned to his battle brothers, "Help me up. Take me to the Grand Master. This is a trap." His voice was low and urgent. In the command center, Urian stood over the holographic map, helmeted face hard but worry creasing his brow. From the displays, the landing zone looked normal. Personnel and equipment continued to descend forward orbit, the deployments proceeding on schedule. On the surface, nothing seemed amiss. The assault along the front continued, but the composition of the attacking force had changed. The old, the weak, and the sick had been pushed until they collapsed, leaving a meter-thick carpet of flesh and blood across the ground. The human servants the Xenos had sent forward, clad in chitinous carapaces and armed with standard auto rifles, now advanced and fell back with grim tactical precision. Beyond the Hive City, using that human wall of bodies for cover, the massed servant army established heavy weapons positions and pounded the landing zone's void shields. Grandmaster Urian's plan for a swift, decisive strike, to sweep the enemy away like autumn leaves, had been turned into a grinding positional war of attrition by the sheer number of slave cannon fodder. Urian Bendigard. A weak, urgent voice called from the command bunker's security door. Urian looked up and saw the Lord of the Five-Pointed Heavenly Army being half-carried by two battle brothers. The Grand Master hurried to meet him, understanding at once how grave the situation was. For a Lord of the Heavenly Host to abandon ceremony and call him by name was no small thing. One hand pressed against his brother's chest plate, the Lord of the Heavenly Host swayed. Urian turned with him, slipping an arm under his brother's and settling him into a nearby armchair. "Why are you so weak?" he asked, worry threaded through his voice. "A minor side effect of using psychic power," his brother replied, shaking his head. He removed a gauntlet to reveal a large, bare hand. "Take off your helmet. I don't have time to explain. I'll transmit the memories directly." Urian would normally never allow another mind access to his own. Psyches could be tampered with, memories altered. But he felt the urgency in his brother's breath, the kind of emergency that brooked no delay. He unclipped his ceramite helm and bowed his head, the gesture a silent promise of trust. The Lord raised his hand. A thin, flickering light gathered at his fingertips. He pressed his thumb to the Grand Master's temple. A 0-degree chill ran through Urian as a fragment of information slid into his consciousness. Psychic light flared from his eyes while images and impressions, those the Lord had touched, unspooled in his mind. It was a snare. The memories showed the Randon's trap, a deliberate test laid to measure the Imperium's strength. The Randon war leader and his elite warriors had been hiding inside the human hive city, using human servants to bleed the Imperium's fighting strength. They planned to remain concealed until the First Legion was exhausted, then emerge to harvest the Imperium's living forces. Urian staggered back, steadying himself on his guards. The truth hit him all at once. His mind went into chaos. The operation had failed. Under his command, the First Legion had marched straight into a Randon trap, and because of his decision, the lives of billions aboard the fleet were now at risk. How had the Xenos known the Imperium would come here and prepared in advance? "Tell the fleet to be on guard for Xenos ambushes," he said, forcing himself to think clearly. He shook his head and pushed away his guard's support. This was not the moment to hunt for the source of an intelligence leak. The immediate problem was far simpler and far uglier. Reorganize, plan, and buy whatever time they could to resist the Randon assault. "Notify the orbital fleet," Urian shouted, his face ashen with anxiety. "Tell them to deploy arms and supplies at once." His order left no room for hesitation. The Grand Master refused to pull back. If anything, he intended to press the landing operation more aggressively. That decision snapped something in the command center. Urian Bendigard, the Lord of the Five-Pointed Heavenly Host, rose to his feet, jabbing a trembling finger at the Grand Master. His voice was sharp with urgency. "Do you not see what this is? It's a trap." "We must withdraw now," he continued, fighting to keep his composure. "Preserve our fighting strength and wait for the Primarch. This battle is already lost. We need to evacuate. Don't let your pride destroy the First Legion." The final words were less an order than a plea. For the Legion. The black-armored soldiers standing at attention in the command center exchanged glances at the Lord's trembling tones. None of them had ever seen the Lord of the Heavenly Host so exposed, so vulnerable. "I know." Urian's eyes glistened. He stepped forward and gripped his brother's shoulder plate. "I know everything, my brother." "Precisely because you know," the Grand Master said, voice flat with command, "we must have the fleet push up supplies for a protracted engagement." The Lord of the Heavenly Host answered in a choked low voice. "It's irreversible. Can we still withdraw?" "We walked straight into a trap the Xenos had prepared down to the last detail," the Grand Master said. "My arrogance led us into it. They want to bleed us out. All we can do is buy time, delay them while we wait for the Primarch." "We hold for 4 months," he continued. "We must preserve the Imperium's forces and keep the ability to strike back." The Lord of the Heavenly Host opened his mouth, but there was nothing to argue. The Grand Master's strategy was grimly correct. 1,000,000 mortal troops had already disembarked, the fleet was moving into the next phase, and the Ecclesiarchy and the Titan Legion were about to touch down. With that many men and war machines on the ground, getting back into orbit would be far harder than coming down. Deploy everything we can spare, the Grand Master ordered. Prepare the fleet to break contact when the moment comes. Send an astropathic message to the Primarch. Urian moved at once, issuing the necessary orders with the cool decisiveness of a legion commander. Brothers of the other legions, obey my command and assemble at these 2 locations. He marked 2 points on the map and ordered the warriors at the other landing zones to move there. That way, all the forces ashore would form a triangular formation, each position able to support the others from fortified ground. Chapter 182. Battle Moon. The Lord of the Five-Mang Heavenly Army fell silent, weighing the Grand Master's words, then inclined his head in approval of the dispositions on the table. The Grand Master's decisions matched what one would expect for the coming clash. 2 heights had been marked on the tactical map, each dominating one of the current landing zones. If the forces from those beaches could reach and hold those high points, they would become defensible strongholds, enough to buy time until the Primarch arrived. Orders were given and executed with ruthless speed. From high orbit, the warships lowered all available combat supplies. Though some of the Legion's warriors still doubted the wisdom of the original landing sites, they obeyed the Grand Master's command. The Lords of the Heavenly Host told their contingents to take the supplies, fight where they had to, and then withdraw toward the Grand Master's position. Aboard the Indomitable Truth, the astropathic choir wove their litanies, voices rising and falling as they shoved their message into the warp and sent it screaming toward the Primarch. The choir convulsed as one. Blood spattered from mouths and nostrils. The sight sent the Legion guards reeling. They shoved the nearest astropath away, severing the psychic link mid-communion. The astropath trembled in the arms of a Legion warrior, muscles spasming so violently that words came in ragged fragments. Warp, gigantic, object, approaching, distortion, he rasped. The warrior acted without hesitation. From his pack, he drew a dose of field medicine and drove the syringe into the man's carotid. The astropath's survival was of little consequence compared to the intelligence he might spill. They needed whatever he knew. Within seconds, the stimulant steadied him. The astropath's eyes cleared enough for him to speak in full sentences, though his voice was already paper-thin. 3 massive bodies in the warp, he said. They're coming. They're corrupting the astropathic channels. We can't send signals. I understand, the Grand Master replied over the command channel. The Legion's commander heard the warning and felt its weight. The respite was brief. The astropath's body convulsed again, the after-effects of the stimulant making a mockery of his mortal frame. He was lucid only long enough to finish what he'd seen before the medicine started tearing him apart. Crack! A Legion warrior snapped the astropath's neck, ending the man's convulsions in a single brutal motion. On the ground nearby, perhaps in response to the probing of the Lord of the Heavenly Host, a slave legion, laden with heavy weapons, surged toward the First Legion's position. Men who had been turned into living artillery charged forward, a tide of iron and flesh. Brothers, hold the line. The company commander on the front rallied the defense. His steady voice cut through the chaos and steadied the men beside him. Before them lay a bloody mist, a mountain of corpses, and an endless flood of humans. The sharp, metallic stench of blood seeped into the Space Marines' respirators. This field had become a slaughter of mortals by Space Marines. Men killing men, and the sight was a mutilation of reason as much as of flesh. They are not our kinsmen, the Marines intoned to the auxiliaries. They are pawns, mind-controlled by Xenos. Destroying them is mercy, release for those souls. Where the Legion bore composure like armor, the morale of the mortal auxiliary army was being eaten away by what they saw. Still, the First Legion's warriors held the line. With a bolt pistol in one gauntleted hand, they hissed orders through their respirators, using their presence and force of will to stiffen the mortals' resolve and keep the defense from cracking. Military judges and MPs, whips coiled at their belts, paced the rear lines in a constant vigil, more to keep the auxiliary army from breaking than to enforce any real law. Inside the ranks, the lasguns never stopped. Beams flashed, cutting down any who broke formation and surged forward in panic. Casualties so far were light, but that owed more to luck and discipline than to the soldiers' resilience. The enemy's autocannons and las weapons were unquestionably lethal to ordinary humans. Mortals were not demigods and did not wear stout ceramite power armor. Fortunately, the void shields held, blunting the enemy's long-range bombardment. Adeptus Mechanicus servitors and tech priests had already converted the ground behind the line into a working fortress. Digging trenches, erecting revetments, and emplacing gun pits with clinical efficiency, automated emplacements, bolted and calibrated with machine logic, were sited to intercept low-velocity shells that slipped past the shields. Red-robed Scutari stood in disciplined clusters along the forward slope, their arc weapons and augmetics shoring up the auxiliary army's thin firepower. From orbit, Titans were still descending, taking up hulking positions on the front and, when needed, hissing lances and thermal blasts into the enemy to plug gaps in the defense. Energy weapons had one undeniable advantage over ballistics. They didn't eat ammunition. They only needed the regular maintenance the Adeptus Mechanicus could provide. That made the Titans dangerously tempting, but Urien did not deploy them lightly. He, as Grand Master, understood that the First Legion and the assault forces first had to stabilize a front and grind the invaders down in a long war of attrition. The Imperium was burning through will and munitions, the Randans spent men. The scale of that human reservoir sickened him. How many people lived in a hive city? The smallest held hundreds of millions, larger ones tens of billions. The gargantuan spires in some worlds housed hundreds of billions. Morse was an industrial world. 4 hive cities loomed over its factories. Even after the initial resistance and the Randans' wanton slaughter and conscription, the Adeptus Mechanicus estimated there were still roughly 1 billion people the Xenos could marshal. That assessment, derived from city sizes and factory capacities and submitted to the Grand Master, hit Urien like a boulder. 1 billion lives. A mountain of manpower pressing down on every decision he made. Not 1 billion frightened people, 1 billion fearless puppets, Urien said into the comm, voice hard. He was bargaining with the Adeptus Mechanicus from orbit. What he wanted was blunt and desperate. A Mechanicus warship scuttled into the front line, its guns and factories welded to the battlefield to hold the line and churn out supplies while it fought. There was a long silence. The mech sage on the other end, one of the few among his order who still bore more human features than machine, actually furrowed his brow before he replied. Grandmaster, is this truly necessary? He asked. My calculations show that while the quantity of these human puppets is immense, their individual threat level is low. Aren't you being overly cautious? Urien shook his head. They're not the whole problem. He forced himself to be calm. Xeno reinforcements will arrive soon. If we don't fix a defensive line now, we won't have the time or the ground to stop them when they come. We need every advantage, even if it means sacrificing a cruiser to anchor the front. The seriousness in Urien's voice gave the sage pause. After a moment of hard thought, the mech sage inclined his head. If you insist, he said finally, a cruiser will descend. I hope your prediction proves true, Grandmaster, and that you make good use of the Omnissiah's gift. A flicker of gratitude passed through Urien's eyes. The First Legion had no shortage of warships that could descend to the surface, but what he needed wasn't another transport or gunship. He needed a factory, a vessel that could continuously churn out arms and ammunition to supply the front. Only an Adeptus Mechanicus warship with an integrated manufactorum could fill that role. Arrangements were made at once. Within hours, a Mechanicus cruiser, its holds packed with machinery, munitions, and technicians, dropped out of orbit. The descent immediately drew a ferocious response from the Randan Xenos. Orbital defense batteries blazed to life, and the sky filled with tracer fire. The cruiser raised its void shields and dove, skimming low to reduce its profile and limit the angles from which the enemy could strike. Urien watched the frenetic counterattack and allowed himself a cold smile. The enemy's panic was a sure sign he'd done the right thing. The 5-kilometer Adeptus Mechanicus cruiser had taken several hits from orbital defenses, and its void shields had been rapidly overwhelmed. Fortunately, by the time the second volley arrived, the ship had dropped below the weapon's firing arc. Under the Mechanicus crew's precise control, it descended slowly and came down inside the Legion's lines. If everything went to plan, it would stay there for good, never to ply the void again. Urian immediately set about turning the Hulk into the centerpiece of a defensive network, and the knot of anxiety in his chest loosened. The warship was his greatest guarantee. Macro cannons couldn't be fired inside the atmosphere. The shockwaves would have devastated the Legion's own ranks, so they had to rely on lances and other energy weapons at reduced output. At full power, those beams would have vaporized anything nearby, but even throttled down, the ship's lances and secondary batteries outclassed the deadliest ground artillery. "Come on," Urian bellowed across every channel, his voice low and raw. "Let the Xenos come. We are ready to resist their attack." In a single day, Urian had thrown up an almost impregnable defense. Did the Xenos mean to buy time? Did they hope to smash the Legion's lines with tide after tide of mind-enslaved bodies? That gamble mattered little to the First Legion. Every deployment Urian had made had stretched his abilities to the limit, but they were the right choices. As the planet's star sank and night fell, the fighting only sharpened. The Randan slave army advanced like a living tide, digging trenches through the piled blood and sucking mud as they pressed again and again at the Legion's line. Their alien masters watched from behind the Hive City's void shields, indifferent to the slaughter. They took a cold pleasure in watching the internecine war of their human wards. For 3 long Terran days, the battle raged. Imperial regiments were rotated off the line to rest and rearm, but the fighting never slackened. The mortal infantrymen's fingers trembled on their triggers, exhaustion etched into every face. The Space Marines were different. They hardly tired, needing only minutes of sleep to return to full efficiency. Urian himself never let go. From the command center, he watched the flow of the battle, all measures and reports under his eye. Sleep was a stranger. His nerves were a coiled wire, his chest a constant tension as he waited for the next blow to land. If the Xenos had been content to sit and wait until the Primarch arrived, holding out would have been simple. But reality had a way of delivering a brutal, unexpected slap. The thing they had feared most had finally made itself known. "Grand Master, gigantic objects are manifesting in the warp." The comm alarm cut through the bridge. The voice on the other end trembled with fear. The alien transmission followed, dripping with triumph. "Vile humans, surrender to fear and bow before the might of our race," the Xenos declared. "Behold the creation that will crush your meager courage, the battle moon." Their triumphant taunts echoed across the common channel. Chapter 183, The Randan Descent. Grandmaster Urian shook his head and offered a bitter smile. The private hope that had lived in the back of his mind had proven hollow. The massive object that had jammed the astropathic channels, after 3 days of travel through the warp, had finally arrived in the Morse system. The Randan reinforcements had come, and they had come in force. They were swift, and their technology was frighteningly advanced. In some respects, their war gear rivaled, even surpassed, that of the Imperium. The Fifth Legion's grim appraisal had been right. The Randan were not merely another Xenos threat, but an existential enemy. Humanity would have to meet them with everything it had. As Urian watched, the system's warp index climbed with relentless speed. Then, without warning, 3 colossal warp rifts opened inside the Morse system, and appearing almost simultaneously, and forming a perfect triangle in space. The fleet registered the anomaly at once. Telescopes swung to lock on the portals, and auger arrays blared to full power, sweeping for any sign of what might pour through. On the command deck, holographic projections traced the new breaches in the fabric of reality. Urian stepped out of the command post and craned his neck toward the sky, where the first hints of something vast and alien were beginning to loom. The display in his helmet zoomed in, bringing the transmitted images into sharp focus. In the system before him, a spherical behemoth was crawling out of the warp, sliding back into real space. It dwarfed Terra's moon, Luna. As it completed its emergence, it pressed down on the void with an almost physical weight. The Xenos' colossal space structures had arrived. 3 battle moons had manifested, and their sheer mass tugged at the nearby orbits. Planets shuddered, the stars themselves seemed to quiver, and human hearts along with them. One battle moon took position in orbit around the planet, its steel bulk radiating an oppressive authority that sent the mortal troops spiraling deeper into dread. After a week under that shadow, what remained of the soldiers' morale was close to collapse. Then a whip cracked, a sharp, ear-splitting boom that cut through the panic. The long lash wielded by the military police sounded more terrifying than the alien construct looming overhead. The auxiliary army lowered their heads, steadied themselves, and opened fire, laying down covering shots to support the cannon fodder troops charging forward. "Brother," Urian said into the comms. He needed to set things in motion. "Grand Master, give your orders." The holographic image of the Lord of the Void Sky Army flickered into view. The Grand Master's face was grave. He knew how dire the situation was. Urian met his gaze. "I'm giving you full authority to take command of the fleet. Preserve your strength and wear the Xenos down. A war of attrition." "You're the better hand at void combat," the Grand Master replied. "I'll stay out of your way. My battlefield is on the ground." "I understand." The projection dimmed as the Grand Master assumed control and began issuing withdrawal orders. Urian let out a long breath, quietly relieved that he had managed to get a single warship down to the surface. The Legion would anchor itself to that ship. With the vessel and the two other high positions, they formed a defensive triangle on the heights. The Xenos could not take the First Legion easily. They would hold until the Primarch arrived. No matter the cost, the First Legion would not yield. They would hold their ground to the death. "Brothers," Urian's voice rang out as he prepared to rally his men. "In 4 months, a Primarch will arrive to sweep away the filthy Xenos and their servants." It was not a rousing speech. Urian did not do rousing speeches, and the First Legion did not need them. They were the strongest legion, now trapped by the Xenos and bound to a defensive line. The Grand Master knew they could fight their way out if they threw everything into the battle, but the price would be catastrophic. They had to preserve their strength so that when the Primarch came, there would still be enough force to strike back. "Hold your ground. Await reinforcements." He buckled his helmet on and took his place at the front to steady the mortal troops. Up close, the fighting looked worse than any report could say. Torn banners, scorched armor, bullet pocks on his brother's breastplates, and the stubborn, weary courage of the mortal soldiers at their feet. A cold guilt rose in him. The First Legion, masters of extermination and annihilation, had been reduced to a passive defense by a confluence of circumstances. Pride had cost the Imperial forces dearly. But it had to be so. There was no turning back now. When the war was over, Urian told himself, he would accept whatever punishment was coming to him. Urian had already decided, whatever punishment came, whether from Imperial authorities or from the Primarch himself, he would accept it. The fleet, under the command of the Lord of the Void Sky Army, slipped away. The coming engagements would be light and mobile. Guerrilla strikes, feints and ambushes, while the main body of the fleet melted into the void to conserve strength. Enormous hatches split open across the battle moons, and void fleets poured out. Each moon disgorged hundreds of semi-organic warships, so that the space around them teemed with vessels. The Morse system, once vast and empty, suddenly felt cramped. The Xenos armada outgunned the Imperium many times over. When the Imperial fleet withdrew, the Randan did not give chase. They expected that with humans still on Morse, Imperial reinforcements would inevitably come. That was their plan from the start. No deviation. Lie in wait at the choke points and spring on any arriving relief. Their human collaborators had provided the tactics, and those tactics were proving brutally effective. Then the Randan cracked Imperial communications and pinpointed Urian. They opened a channel and broadcast their contempt in clear Imperial tongue. "Insignificant human, lay down your weapons and surrender. Become a servant of our race." It posed with insolent arrogance, as if taking pleasure in humiliating the humans. Urian said nothing. Finally, he was looking at a Xenos, the true Randan. The creature's exterior was a shell of gray rock-like scales. Its lower body rested on 6 thick legs, each joint splayed outward so it could pivot and run in any direction with terrifying ease. The first thing Urian noticed was that this thing wasn't a single organic body, but a living suit of bio-armor. Its real form must be much smaller. The armored waist was a rotating platform. The design of the lower half left no room for an internal body at all. Above that platform, the armor's upper half bristled with weaponized limbs, two heavy, multi-jointed primary arms, and a host of retractable tentacles that slid in and out like tools. The head was a rounded dome ringed with monitors, giving it a full 360-degree field of view. Sprouting from the top was a fleshy antenna about a foot long, pink and soft like exposed tissue. The armor itself had no face. Instead, mounted above its torso was a grotesque, living visage. Eyes unnaturally wide, a nasal cavity like a skull, a mouthful of razor teeth, and a long, ugly tongue that periodically licked one of those fangs. The Xenos' face was terrifying, so terrifying that any ordinary soldier would have fled the battlefield at the sight of it. Grandmaster Urian studied the creature intently, committing its features to memory. A quick assessment told him what mattered. The Randon's visible armor was formidable, but its true body underneath was likely fragile. Urian snorted and lifted an ironclad boot. "Filthy creature, you're not even worth licking my boot," he said, loud enough for the comms to carry. "You hide from the front lines behind your slaves. Have you come out to die now?" The insult struck raw. The Randon's bio-armor shuddered, and white steam hissed from the seams as it boiled over with rage. It was worshipped by its slaves, treated like a god. How dare anyone humiliate it so? "I am Randon war leader Lolos," it spat into the channel. "I will personally train you to be my obedient dog, licking 10,000 boots a day." "Then come and try," Urian replied contemptuously. "The Legion is right here. I only wonder if you have the courage to face humans without your slave army in front of you." "Just you wait," Lolos snarled, and the connection cut off in a crackle of static. Communications between Xenos and humans were never friendly. The message came terse and blunt. "Prepare to counter the Xenos' attack. They're very powerful. Probe them first." Urian curled a cold smile. He had baited the Xenos deliberately, forcing them into a direct engagement that would let him gather the intelligence he needed. In orbit, the alien warships shifted, their broadsides trained on Morse. From posterior apertures along their hulls, circular bio-eggs were expelled. The drop pods streaked through the atmosphere, slipping between the arcs of human anti-air fire, and slammed down in front of the hive city. The ovate shells split open, sticky fluids flooding the soil, and towering Rondon elite warriors crawled out. Massive and clad in gray, rock-like bio-armor, they were as tall as space marines. In one primary hand, each gripped a living biogun, in the other, a curved war scythe of bone. Dozens of writhing bio-tentacles unfurled from their torsos, the tips catching a cold, hard light and serving as razor-small blades. 1,000 Randon fell like a thunder of gods. The enslaved human populace surged in a mix of panic and awe, reacting as if deities had descended among them. Gakakaka! A grotesque face on the bio-armor's abdomen split open and from a built-in emitter vomited a high, keening roar. The sound struck the human conscripts like a physical blow, driving panic through their ranks. From the hive city behind them, waves of Xenos constructs, sleek, alien machines, rolled forward toward the human lines. Artillery slammed into the advancing things, and ripples crawled across their surfaces as if an unseen skin adjusted to each impact. The reaction revealed a directional defense system, and behind those machines strode elite warriors and towering war engines, the signal that the battle had passed into its second, most savage phase. Close-quarters slaughter was imminent. The Xenos' human collaborators set up a terrible chorus of cries and ran to keep pace with the machines, surging toward the defenders. Tank treads and tracked carapaces bit into flesh, grinding bodies as they passed, mangling limbs and spilling organs in a churn of blood and torn cloth. The auxiliary army held its fire where it could, then opened up in disciplined volleys, red laser dots strobing across the charging mob, every shot finding a turncoat. Low-energy projectiles punched through shields and left smoking holes where men had stood moments before. When the enemy closed to measured distance, the Space Marines fell silent. Bolters clicked shut, and cold, lethal close combat gear was drawn. For an instant, the world narrowed to the hiss of weapons and the reek of blood, then a single ugly cry rose from the line. "Filthy Xenos! Receive the wrath of the Astartes!" someone roared, and the Legion surged forward. Armored warriors, each armed for a different role, broke from the lines to meet the enemy, moving to blunt the Xenos charge and hold the line so the mortals could consolidate a steady volume of fire. From behind them, the vehicles of the heavenly host of iron swung into action. Tanks and other battlefield platforms rumbled up, weapons trained and engines screaming as they laid down brutal supporting fire for their brothers. Power swords and bolters flared, and shimmering force fields took and diverted lethal blows. In the smoke and flare of battle, the warriors of the First Legion met the alien intruders head-on. Shift work is brutal. I'm posting 3 chapters for now. The rest are still being written, and I can't promise when or if they'll be released. The official Randon setting is frustratingly vague. Melding its scarce canon with original material makes the world building a real challenge. Chapter 184, The Power of Peers, Space Marines, the Emperor's finest creations. Superhuman warriors in ceramite armor, wielding power weapons and warlike resolve, forged to bring the galaxy to heel. Their black-plated silhouettes were the most terrifying promise to an enemy and the most reassuring sight to a human under fire. Now, those black-armed figures moved into the breach. They planted themselves before the mortal lines, hulking shields who absorbed the Randon onslaught and bought desperate seconds for the infantry to return fire. The Randon advanced behind shimmering shield generators, using crude, brutal close-quarters tactics meant to smash and overwhelm the fragile humans. To the Xenos, the mortals were expendable, no more than livestock to be driven and devoured. The Space Marines did not flinch. The First Legion of the Heavenly Host, the original brothers, strode out like living thunder, unleashing the raw, concentrated wrath of mankind. Against the elite warriors of the Randon, their faces were untroubled. These were foes the Legion had seen and slain 1,000 times over. They moved with brutal efficiency, charging like lightning across the blasted ground, ceramite plates clanking, power weapons singing and bolters coughing fire. Where the Randon had hoped to break a fragile line, they found themselves smashed by an iron wall. The mortals behind the Marines found space to breathe and to fight. In the shadow of the black armor, the defenders found their chance, and the battle turned. At the human front, soldier faced soldier, commander faced commander. The Randon's enslaved humans surged like a tide toward the auxiliary army's positions, only to smash against a black wall. The First Legion had formed that wall. As the oldest legion, they had the Emperor's permission to use forbidden weapons. Even their ordinary kit was ostentatious. Field barriers shimmered into being. Every warrior carried a humming power weapon. They were Space Marines. Mortals looked fragile beside them, like soft meat striking an armored vehicle. Reflexes that read like milliseconds, movements honed to deadly economy, and power armor that amplified every motion in perfect sync. Around them, bolters barked, lasers cracked, and plasma lanced the air. The Space Marines met the first wave with swinging blades and immovable discipline. The Randon thralls screamed like the maddened, "Whack! Whack!" Their eyes bloodshot with bloodlust, blades raised to tear down anything in their path. Fanaticism showed on every face. One of the thralls lunged close. A sword flashed, a single bright arc, and before the man could even cry out, he was gone. Before the Imperial lines, tens of thousands of bodies dropped at once, and the screams died in an instant. 1,000 warriors of the Crown Heavenly Host, First Legion Marines, cut down 10 times their number at point-blank range in less than a second. Power swords shimmered with tearing arcs of lightning, while power hammers flashed like thunder that dissolved flesh, breaking the surging tide of humans with each clash. The First Legion never acted on impulse. They measured their line with cold precision. Execute the cannon fodder, then fall back. Their motions were perfectly synchronized, a single living machine that advanced and withdrew as one. They surged forward, slaughtered the press, and pulled back after a heartbeat. Repeated again and again until at the edge of the void shield the dead lay more than a meter deep. Behind them, the Adeptus Mechanicus guards stepped up and ignited their Prometheum flamers. Through gaps in the Space Marine ranks, they sprayed searing fire, incinerating both living attackers and the piled corpses so the bodies would not clog the line of fire. Before the battle line was a roiling sea of flame. Nothing living could cross the twin barricades. One barrier glowed like a furnace of high-temperature promethium. The other was a hard, implacable wall of steel. Space Marines locked shoulder to shoulder. A piercing shriek cut through the artillery din. The sonic array spat a single contemptuous word, useless humans. The Randan elite warriors jeered from behind their ranks, cursing the slaves who had been thrown forward to die for them. They showed no mercy, only contempt for the weakness they had sacrificed. "Filthy Xenos, face us," came the Space Marines' reply, cold and immediate. "Is hiding behind others all you know?" A new sound answered them, a deep, muffled roar that rolled over the battlefield like distant thunder and briefly drowned the cannonade. "Despicable humans! Now see our strength!" The Randan elite screamed, unable to bear being humiliated by a slave-born race. They activated their bioarmor. Dozens of living suits flexed into motion, each fitted with 6 multi-jointed legs that scuttled with terrifying speed, fast enough to rival a Space Marine's charge. "Excellent!" came a single, fierce cry from the human line. The Lord of the Heavenly Host, Blade Edge, stepped forward and led his most elite warriors into a tight, disciplined formation. Steel met steam and fury on the field as both sides braced for the collision. The Randan's weakness is the torso. Their limbs are largely insensate. "Brothers, stay alert." Over the comms, the Lord of the Heavenly Host laid out the Xenos' vulnerability, then gave a single, precise order. "Fall back 10 paces." Boots clattered in perfect unison. 1,000 Space Marines obeyed, stepping back 10 paces as the Randan charge closed. The Xenos' laughter rose in derision. Cowards, delighted at what they took for a rout. Even these supposedly mighty humans had chosen to retreat rather than meet them head-on. "Xenos are too dull to grasp higher reasoning," the Lord sneered through the channel, contempt dripping from his voice. A Randan's sharp jeer began, but it died on its lips when the creatures realized the truth. Tanks and heavy batteries from the human positions were already trained on the ground they had just abandoned. They had overrun the forward line and left the safety of their shield cover suddenly exposed inside a human kill zone. "Blast them to pieces!" The heavy emplacements opened up at once. Tanks and automated turrets, every heavy ground weapon available, pounded the Randan elite with a relentless barrage. Artillery rounds, beam cannons, heavy bolters, turning the air at the edge of the energy shield into a wall of fire. "Despicable humans!" The Randan shrieked as their bio-armor flared with shield energy, and they tore through the storm to reach cover. The price they paid was catastrophic. A single concentrated strike cut down nearly half their elite force in an instant. "Stop them!" The Lord of the Heavenly Host's eyes flickered with surprise. These Xenos carried personal shields. Their defensive systems far outclassed those of the Legion warriors. No sooner had the command been given than the Legion closed the gap. In the space of a heartbeat, they crossed the 10 paces between lines. Steel met shield and claw in a rolling, brutal melee as Xenos elites and Legion warriors became locked together. The Legion pushed forward relentlessly, determined to prevent the Randan from widening their formation and slipping back into the safe zone. The Randan's bio-armor proved as formidable as a Space Marine's, every clash ringing harder and costing both sides dearly. But the Legion fought to drive them out and finish them before the Xenos could regroup. If the Randan slave forces managed to break into the auxiliary army lines, the Imperial front would collapse under the sheer weight of numbers. The Legion could not afford to let that happen. On the edge of the fray, a Legion warrior met one of the Randan in brutal close combat. He swung his power sword with practiced speed, aiming for the alien's torso. The blade rang against something harder than bone, a sharp clang that split the air. He stared in surprise as the Randan's curved, osseous blade flared, arcs of blue-white energy dancing along its edge. The Legionnaire pushed harder. His power armor hissed as systems ramped to full processing. The Randan answered the force in kind, Urva muscles inside its bio-armor, whining a warning. The two weapons locked, vibrating violently under the strain. Neither combatant gave an inch. The Legionnaire broke the engagement first. He stepped back, fluidly evading a brutal close-in strike, recalibrated his stance, and prepared his next riposte. In brief probes across the line, the First Legion discovered the unsettling truth. These Xenos reacted as fast as a Space Marine, and their strength output matched the Marines' own. They were no mere cannon fodder. If the Randan reached the auxiliary ranks, the consequences would be catastrophic. For a heartbeat, The line by the energy shield fell quiet as both sides pulled back. Aliens and legionnaires fixed each other with steady, unreadable gazes. The Randan were motionless. A proud people who had ridden the stars and bred warriors without peer, they found themselves facing an enemy equal to their legend. Worse, their opponents were not some unknown Xenos at all, but humans, the very species the Randan had kept in chains for generations. The Legion troopers felt the surprise, but not the dread. They had faced far stranger and stronger foes. Discipline and experience steadied them. After a probing exchange, the two elites crashed back into combat. The Randan moved like a nightmare made of limbs. 6 legs skittered and spun, their multidirectional mobility almost ghostly, while plasma projectors never ceased hissing fire. Against them, the First Legion's veterans were unerring. Each strike was timed and aimed to the millimeter. Nowhere remained for the Randan to slip away. Bioarmor tendrils twitched in the melee, and single-molecule blades, razors honed to an obscene thinness, came at the Xenos from angles that cleaved ceramite as if it were cloth. All that experience and brutality mattered. Though the Randan had long enslaved humanity and thought they knew human frailties, the First Legion's veterans turned those assumptions against them. In the end, the balance broke. The Randan were overwhelmed, and the Xenos force was exterminated. Everything had happened in an instant, but the outcome was absolute. Their primary weapons intercepted the Space Marines' strikes, while the Xenos' own blades and bladed tentacles sought the weak points in the power armor. Throat, heart, the joints, striking with unnerving precision. Within a few exchanges, the Randan's attacks had become almost surgical. It was as if they knew Space Marines' anatomy by heart, even aiming for the secondary heart. The head, that's the Randan's true body. Hit the brain, crackled a voice over the comlink. A brother legionnaire had fresh intelligence. A veteran, moving with frightening economy and skill, ended an elite Randan in a single stroke. His power sword punched through the Xenos' shield and cleaved its bioarmor. Black, oily fluid spilled onto the deck, and the creature's true form was suddenly exposed. Where the blade had struck, a lattice of deep red, bionic nerve cables fanned out like a spiderweb. At their center hung a swollen, viscous brain, dark green tissue trembling in spasms. Beneath it clustered dozens of whisker-like tentacles around a hollow, circular maw, and a pair of golden eyes turned up toward the Space Marine, full of raw terror. "This is your pathetic form." The veteran drove his blade down, the disintegration field humming to reduce the Randan's skull to dust. He expected the creature to be finished, then he saw a cunning glint in the Xenos' eye. Alarm flared through him, and he stumbled back, shouting a warning. "Human!" The Randan's mouth opened in a high, keening shriek. An invisible shockwave rippled outward, and with a sick, wet pop, its hideous brain burst free of the armor and lunged straight for the veteran legionnaire. Chapter 183. There's a traitor in the Empire. A sudden, prickling fear, the fear of the Randan, flared in the veteran's mind. He knew at once the creature approaching them radiated psychic contamination. A muffled groan cut the air. Another Legion warrior slumped to the ground. Several Randan were unusually powerful. Blades flashed and found vital points, ending a Death Angel before anyone could react. From the alien's circular maw, a pink, barbed spike slid out, slick with viscous fluid, the same sort of spike that crowned the head of the biological armor. The Randan probed forward, confident that by lodging that mouthpart into a warrior, it could seize control and turn the fighter against his comrades. It froze, however, when its golden eyes met an armored hand thrust straight at it, fingers splayed. "I am a warrior of the Emperor," the veteran growled. He seized the creature and with brutal precision drove his thumb into its eye, gouging it out. Then, voice low and iron hard, he intoned, "Weakness and fear, faint instincts suppressed to the extreme." He tightened his grip. The Randan's tentacles writhed, and in agony from the pressure, began to coil helplessly around the veteran's cold armor. A sickening splat, the Randan entity was crushed and burst under sheer force. Beware its death throes. The Randan try to take your minds. Their psychic contamination prods out weakness and fear. A veteran barked, repeating the warning over the Vox to keep his Legion brothers from being ambushed. When the First Legion received the alert, they launched a savage counterstroke and tore through the Randan elite. It wasn't that the Randan lacked strength. Against an ordinary squad of Space Marines, the fight might have been close. But the veterans of the First Legion were tempered by countless battles. Their experience overwhelmed the alien warriors, and the Randan bled heavily. In the first wave, the Legion lost 100 men, while cutting down 500 Randan elites. Then a chorus of piercing screams rose from the Imperial front. The mortal auxiliaries froze, eyes gone wide, then dropped their weapons, clutching at their heads and ripping at their hair. The psychic contamination released by the crushed Randan tore through their already battered minds and shattered them. Panic spread through the ranks like a chain reaction. Mortals along the front lines screamed, dropped their weapons, and fled. The crack of military police whips echoed through the smoke, but it could not stop the auxiliary army from breaking. A Space Marine's bolter barked, and a spray of shells cut down those who staggered out of formation. A few hard-bitten soldiers, clear-eyed and knowing the cost of psychic contamination, turned their lasguns on frenzied comrades and shot them without hesitation. They had learned the lesson the field taught most cruelly. The sight of human companions gone mad and charging the line was proof enough of the contagion. Within 10 seconds, the Imperial line was stabilized and the destabilizing elements purged. With the Randan elite warriors slain, the alien war engine pulled back, inching away from the human front. The charging fanatics had been nothing more than expendable meat. They could not compare to honored warriors or the costly efficiency of war machines. The corpses at the front were quickly cleared, the Imperial forces reorganized, and preparations were made for the next wave of battle. Inside the command fortress, Urian gave a small, silent nod as he reviewed the damage reports coming from the front lines. The kill ratio stood at roughly 1 Legion casualty for every 5 Randan elite warriors, a figure he judged acceptable. As the operation continued and the Space Marines learned more about their enemy, that advantage could widen. 2 more feeds on the command console showed the same pattern. Both other defensive bases were under synchronized assaults by the Randan. In total, the aliens had committed 3,000 elite warriors across the 3 positions. The First Legion had suffered Saint over 500 killed in action. The Adeptus Mechanicus Ecclesiarchy Guard took fewer direct hits, but they paid a heavy price in a different way. The majority of their mortal casualties resulted from sudden mental collapse rather than battlefield wounds. A single directive flashed across the comms: strictly forbidden to consume Randan flesh to gain intelligence. Their bodily fluids are the source of psychic control and will contaminate the warriors' minds. Urian reiterated the order with no tolerance for exceptions. No legionnaire was to ingest Randan brain tissue or other fluids. The risk of psychic contamination was too great to ignore. The fighting had quieted for the moment. Urian turned from the battle map to the steel table at his side, where an observation report waited. He picked up the data slate and tossed it onto the command console. The slate was read automatically. A holographic projection sprang up between the monitors. As he studied it, his expression grew darker. The slate compiled reports from every unit that had been struck, distress pings from void ships before they went dark, and sensor logs from the 3 defensive bases that had been assaulted. What it showed was chilling. The alien warships understood Imperial designs better than anyone had expected. They had cataloged ship types, maneuvering envelopes, effective firing ranges, even weapon loadouts. In some of the earliest void engagements, the aliens had gone further than reconnaissance. Certain enemy vessels mimicked Imperial transponder signals, slipping through identification screens and luring whole formations into ambushes. Those deceptions had cost the fleet dearly, until the Void host reacted and altered our identification protocols, closing that particular loophole before it could be exploited again. On the ground, the picture was equally grim. The Randan elite struck with terrifying precision, aiming for the Space Marines' vital points rather than engaging in indiscriminate firefights. Every piece of data pointed to an enemy that didn't just fight, it learned. The ambush in the Morse star system had exposed a single, terrible truth. Imperial intelligence had been compromised. The Randan's apparent weakness, their staged panic at first contact, everything had been an act, a carefully constructed facade to lull the Empire into a false sense of security. Only after Imperial forces walked into the trap did the aliens drop the mask and strike with everything they had. Urien felt it in the double thump of his two hearts. He had faced monsters and dread things before, and never known real fear. Now, as Grand Master of the First Legion, he felt something colder, a shadow inside the Empire itself. A high-ranking official was colluding with the Randan. If that rot ran unchecked, the losses to humanity could not be counted. "This must not be revealed," he warned the command chamber, lowering his voice until it was almost a rasp. "Not a word. The implications are too vast." No one replied aloud. The mortals acknowledged him with measured nods. The Space Marines stood like carved statues, unreadable and motionless. Urien slid the data slate into a sealed compartment and locked it. He would keep it safe and get it to someone who could act without delay. A leak at this scale could come from only one place, very high in the Empire, and it would take ruthless, careful hands to root it out. Only the Primarchs, Lord Malkador, or the Master of Mankind could turn this tide. Beep, beep, beep. The red alert flashed across the command console as another wave of Randan ships released deployment pods. Grandmaster Urien watched the feed without emotion. The aliens had escalated. 10,000 elite warriors now dropped toward their position. Simultaneous strikes were occurring at the other two defensive bases as well, elite forces descending from high orbit in coordinated assaults. He said nothing. His hands moved with practiced precision, issuing orders and diverting reserves, running through deployment protocols as if reciting prayer. Inside, however, he prayed for one thing, that the Primarch would arrive in time. There was no one else who could change the outcome. The First Legion would hold. Urien knew that with grim certainty. They would fight to the last man to blunt the enemy's advance and to safeguard the data slate cradled in their midst. That intelligence could not fall into alien hands. The truth had to reach the Primarch. If the information made it to him, the Empire could be warned in time about the traitors within, those who had colluded with the Randan to betray humanity. That single, terrible hope held the command center together as the alarm screamed and the pods streaked down from orbit. Urien thought for a moment, then issued another order. "Do not sally forth carelessly. The army must remain under the protection of the Void Shields. Adeptus Mechanicus personnel are to monitor them continuously and ensure they operate without interruption." He had to guarantee the Imperial Legion was safe from orbital strikes. Warships and the Continental-class shield generators were synchronized, forming a multi-layered field to blunt any alien bombardment. Urien was quietly grateful to the engineers of the Dark Age of technology. For a defender, the Void Shield was the greatest invention. The First Legion's shields, derived from even older, more potent systems, were far more powerful than the standard models. They would deny the enemy the option of ultra-long-range saturation bombardment, forcing the attackers into close-quarters engagements if they hoped to break the Legion. Besides, the alien leader, Lolos, had no intention of leveling Morseworld. His goal was to encircle the First Legion and strike at the relief fleet to gain leverage that might draw other Imperial legions into the fight. For all those reasons, Urien was confident the First Legion could hold its position until the Primarch arrived. What worried Urien now was not the First Legion itself, but the possibility of the Lord of the 21st Legion coming to their aid. 3 battle moons and hundreds of alien capital ships made for a terrifying concentration of force. He could only hope the Void Host's warning would reach the Primarch in time. He sighed and turned back to the command console. The Randan assault had already begun. When they realized Morse was an ambush and that astropathic communications were being jammed, the Grandmaster had ordered several ships to slip out toward human-held space to transmit a warning to the Primarch. The First Fleet was making for the system through the warp, and Doom had, of course, received the alert. The vessels that escaped Morse flooded the void with dense astropathic transmissions, so many that most Imperial formations in the eastern end stellar territory picked them up. The news that the First Legion was besieged stunned the other legions. "How much longer? When will we reach the Morse star system?" Doom asked. He sat on the edge of the training ground, fingers tapping on the stone steps. His voice was calm, but the tempo of the tapping and the set of his jaw betrayed his anxiety. Messages from the front had dwindled to almost nothing. It was becoming harder and harder to get a clear picture of the First Legion's status, but Doom was certain of one thing. They had not been wiped out. The aliens were using the Legion as bait. It was an old tactic: surround a position and wait for the relief column to arrive, then strike, but effective. Doom stared at the star chart and felt the familiar chill of plans clicking into place. "My lord, our warp drives are faster," came a soft voice. Francisca, the navigator, leaned over the console. "We'll arrive in 60 days. Her tone left no room for argument. The calculation was precise and final. Chapter 186. Hope has arrived. When the precise coordinates came through, Doom visibly relaxed. He nodded and addressed the apparently empty air in front of him. "Very good. Hold our course and keep deviations to an absolute minimum." Francisca's voice answered, carrying a quiet note of pride. "I am monitoring the warp lanes constantly. We will arrive with negligible error." Doom raised a holographic display and reviewed Sophia's status. Based on the intelligence they'd received, the First Fleet had already drawn up multiple tactical contingencies for an encounter with the Xenos. Factory warships traveling with the fleet had been outfitted with war technology, so they could fabricate specialized equipment as needed. Though still some distance from the fighting, the fleet was anything but unprepared. As the feed scrolled, a hard light flashed in Doom's eyes. If Randon intended to use the First Legion as bait, he had chosen a dangerous tactic. The First Fleet was no passive trap. It was a predator in its own right. If pushed, Doom would see Randon dragged down with it. With that resolve, the fleet surged through the warp toward the Morse star system at a speed that far outpaced anything the Xenos or Urian had expected. Doom had prepared a grand gift for Randon, hoping the Xenos would graciously accept it. On Morse World, in the Morse star system, the relentless fighting had dragged on for 55 Terra days. Randon's assaults came in waves, constantly probing for weaknesses in the First Legion's defenses, but they found no gaps in the human lines. After the first 3,000 Randan elite warriors were repelled by the First Legion, the enemy offensive lost momentum. Having taken enormous losses, the elites stopped mounting direct attacks and instead began sending forward human thralls to sap the Empire's ammunition and supplies. But the Empire's stockpiles seemed inexhaustible. Urian's decision had been prudent. With a Mechanicus warship attached to provide production and resupply, the Imperial Legion did not have to fear running out of ammunition. "Grand Master, here are the casualty figures for the last 3 hours. The computer handed a glowing data slate to Urian. He accepted it. "Thank you," he murmured, voice hoarse and worn. Stubble roughened his jaw, and the bags under his eyes were dark and deep. Urian's exhaustion was not physical, but mental. As Grand Master in charge of the entire ground campaign, the strain on his nerves far exceeded what any ordinary person could imagine. After finishing the briefing, the helplessness in his eyes only deepened. The mortal auxiliary army was being chewed up rapidly. Fewer than half of its soldiers remained combat effective. The mortal levies the Empire had supplied to the Primarch were simply too few. They could not withstand the constant attrition inflicted by Randon's slave forces. Even the Mechanicus 300,000 elite Skitarii had been cut roughly in half in the long grind. Because Randon had not committed his own elite warriors, Space Marine casualties were minimal, almost negligible. That said, the Empire's high-end forces were far from unscathed. In one engagement, when Randon attacked with 3,000 men, it took the Legion several days of ferocious fighting to wipe them out, and the price was steep, over 5,000 legionnaires killed. The Legion had deployed 40,000 warriors, split among 3 defensive bases, yet the numerical advantage did little to prevent severe losses in this war of attrition. At the gateway of the command fortress, the Lord of the 5-Mang Heavenly Army strode in, breathless and urgent. "Grand Master," he announced, voice tight, "my psychic sight has picked up a major crisis." He slammed his hand against the stone beside him as if to steady himself. "Beyond the range of our auspex, billions of mortal cannon fodder have massed, surrounding us from every direction. Tens of thousands of Randon elite warriors are poised, moving in concert with them, ready to strike our lines. Beads of sweat dotted his brow. The vision had shaken even him. The Xeno battle moons will descend soon and crush our defenses. They mean to further sap our strength. Urian's face went dark. He stepped forward and gripped the other's forearm. In your sight, he asked, voice clipped with hope and fear, did you see the Primarch arrive? The Lord of the Five-Mang Heavenly Army could only shake his head, pale. No. Regarding the Primarch's prophecy, there is only endless darkness. The words hit Urian like a physical blow. He staggered back, tall frame wavering, and 100 regrets surged through him all at once. It felt as if something were gnawing at his heart. His composure collapsed. His failures flickered before him in sharp, accusing images. Decisions he had made, orders he had given, were playing like slides in a blinding lantern. If not for his stubborn pride and arrogance, his Legion comrades might still be alive, and the Imperial forces would not be on the brink of annihilation. His face, stripped of command, was a portrait of brokenness. 2 guards caught him from behind and kept him from falling. Around him, the command center felt suffocating. The Lord of the Heavenly Host stood with head bowed, and the mood was one of utter despair. The Legion was facing extinction. No, no, Urian's voice rose, raw and desperate. He shook his head violently, as if he could ward the truth away, and for a moment a tiny, stubborn glimmer of hope flickered in his eyes. The Grand Master burst into the command center so frantic that the Lord of the Five-Mang Heavenly Army instinctively took a step back. Grand Master, he asked cautiously, what's wrong? We're on the verge of victory. Urian, who had only just recovered from a brief collapse, said with sudden, unmistakable confidence, our reinforcements are almost here. The officers exchanged doubtful looks. Some clearly wondered whether the strain had finally cracked him. Urian's tired, defeated features sharpened. He stood taller as he met their skeptical gazes. I know it, he said. The Primarch's forces are on their way. Then why are the Randan Xenos converging on us? One of his brothers demanded. If reinforcements are coming, why would they risk attacking us now? Urian's eyes swept the room, searching for someone to voice what he hoped was true, an answer that would rally them. A mortal at the edge of the room suddenly cried out, voice bright with exhilaration. The big fish has taken the bait, he shouted, then, as if overcome with reverence, straightened and dropped to one knee. Yes, the big fish has taken the bait, Urian said with a thin smile as he crossed the command floor and helped the mortal to his feet. They must have some method of observing the warp. They knew the Imperial reinforcements were coming and moved to cut us off before we could link up with them. The Grand Master spoke his deduction plainly. The Space Marines around the hollow table exchanged looks, then slowly nodded. The logic was sound, the likelihood high. Urian spread his hand. 5 days, he said, then checked himself. 7, at most. The Primarch will arrive. He had worked the numbers in his head, measuring the reach of the Xeno battle moon's interference against astropathic transmissions. Prepare yourselves, he ordered, dismissing his Legion brothers with a curt gesture. If we can hold out for 7 days, victory will be ours. No sooner had the words left his lips than the deck shuddered beneath them. Holographic warnings flared. The Xeno Titan units had landed. Urian snapped open the comm channel and, voice ringing with iron, shouted, Brothers, Imperial soldiers, I have received news. Reinforcements will arrive in no more than 7 days. A son of the Emperor, a mighty Primarch, will bring ruin to the abominable Xenos. The Grand Master's voice filled every open channel. For a beat there was only stunned silence, then a ragged cheer rose from every post that could hear him. In the bleakest hour that hope had been a fragile thing, but his announcement made it thunderous and real. The Empire's 3 defensive bases had been repaired as best they could, their ramparts rebuilt and sentry walks manned. From the highest watchtower of the central fort, a thin black line marked the horizon. The duty watchman raised his binoculars and pushed the magnification to the limit. When the image resolved, his hand went slack, and his breath left him in a hiss. It was not a distant ridge or a cloud at all, but a dense, unending tide of enemy troops, stretching beyond the sightline in a dark, seething band. He slammed the alarm. Klaxons screamed through the compound. Urian, standing at the command console, felt the hair on his scalp rise and his heart skip a beat. The Auspex screens across all 3 bases lit up, a ring of tight crimson contacts stamping the perimeter. Red dots clustered and swarmed at the edges of sensor range, closing in from every direction. They were surrounded. All batteries, open fire! From the Imperial defensive bases, every available weapon belched flame and iron into the advancing horde. Dense arrays of guns and launchers, exhaust streaming behind them, pelted the human sea below. Waves of men were vaporized outright, torn to blood and dust. But for every score that fell, 10 more surged forward. It was nowhere near enough. Randon had put everything into this. Every battery, every ship, every citizen pressed into the line, willing to sacrifice its entire population in a single decisive blow. Units in the line of fire, take cover. Macro cannon charging, ready to fire. The Mechanicus warning cut through the chaos. The warship's macro cannon was the kind that needed a long, slow charge. When it went, nothing nearby would mistake its intent. The shot hit like a planet's heartbeat. A colossal shell, visible even to the naked eye, loosed from orbit and fell, seeming to hang for a terrible instant above the human mass before it slammed down and erupted in a mushroom cloud. The shockwave rolled outward with unstoppable force. Dust and rubble slammed into the city walls and swept away anyone who hadn't managed to dive for cover. One round of that macro cannon obliterated 30 million humans in an instant, a monstrous, indiscriminate toll that did nothing to halt the onward surge. Praise the Omnissiah! The shout rolled through the ranks of the Mechanicus, sparking a fierce fervor in their hearts. Their mechanical voices, precise, reverent, and strangely human, joined into a single, clamorous chorus of praise. Chapter 187. Clash of the Titans. Continue the atomic strike. Urian ordered the Arsenal brothers, unleashing forbidden weapons against the stunned mortal slaves. If the auxiliary army was allowed to hold its ground, they might last until reinforcements arrived, so it had to be destroyed. On the Grand Master's command, dozens of missiles armed with nuclear warheads streaked into the thickest enemy concentrations. Tens of kilometers from the defensive base, dazzling fireballs blossomed, vaporizing every living thing within their blast radii. Other warheads failed to detonate, but their radiation did its work just as ruthlessly. Skin rotted, muscle sloughed away in layers, and cellular life slowly ceased. Radiation weapons, one of the First Legion's many forbidden armaments, were devastatingly effective against vast, dense biological targets. More nuclear strikes detonated in succession, unleashing the culmination of atomic power honed over tens of thousands of years. The blasts consumed flesh and, in the Grand Master's grim rhetoric, purged the sins of the treacherous mortals. Phosphorus warheads turned flesh and fabric into flame, making the crowd look as if it were boiling. The weapons were devastating against unshielded targets. Searing light forced legionnaires to look away and made ordinary mortals slam their eyes shut to avoid retinal burns. Only the Adeptus Mechanicus knelt, raising their voices in worship. Glory to the Omnissiah! A single volley wiped out 80% of the population and broke the immediate danger of being overwhelmed. But both human and Xeno onlookers understood that this terrifying display was only the prelude to the main assault. Beyond the ruined ranks, at the gates of the Hive City occupied by the Randa, colossal Xeno-Titans loomed. Their hulking forms, wrapped in shimmering shields, rotated slowly as if curious, watching impassively while humanity destroyed itself. The Randa Titans were essentially the biological armor of their elite warriors, blown up to monstrous scale. The smallest stood 15 meters tall, others reached 30, and the largest towered to 50 meters, an army of living fortresses ready to descend. They were far more heavily armed than the earlier waves had been. Biocannons ringed their chests and rib cages, 2 colossal barrels jutted from each shoulder, and multiple shield generators sat like carapace plates at their shoulder blades. Their arms ended in bioplasma cannons, and their aerial tentacles shimmered with crackling, disintegrating lightning. Xeno boarding craft drifted down, disgorging squads of elite warriors, and something far larger behind them. The holographic feed made Urian's pupils narrow. The Randa Overlords had arrived. The Randa Warleader and Overlord were apex units, a tier above the regular elites in every way. A Titan-class Xeno loomed forward, and its sonic array came alive, broadcasting a contemptuous voice that rolled across the battlefield. Despicable mortals, kneel, accept the brain fluid of our race, and become our slaves. That is your only choice. The Titan's sonic pulses were visible in the air, throwing off shockwaves that rattled the Imperial ranks and shook the courage from many of the defenders. Urien recognized Lolos's voice the instant it came through. He routed the transmission into the Imperial Titan's comms and answered the Xeno's arrogance with cold contempt. "Xeno mongrel," he said, "lay down your arms and accept the Imperial purge." The two leaders had traded insults for the entire length of the war. Neither expected politeness now. Lolos sneered. "Urien Bendigard," he spat. "After today, you'll be groveling before me, licking my boots." Urien didn't flinch. "Bring it on. Your time is running out. My reinforcements are arriving soon." "How do you know?" Lolos blurted. Then the voice cut off for a breath. When it came back, it was all venom. "Vile human!" For a heartbeat, Lolos went white with realization. He had been baited into revealing something, tricked into exposing his intentions. Urien's smile widened. The deduction had been the exact outcome he'd hoped for. He let the mockery roll out, low and savage. "With that kind of intellect, the title of war leader is far too grand for you. I'm sure there's a floor-scrubbing job in my quarters that would suit you perfectly." Lolos ground his teeth, unable to counter the insult, and with a roar of fury threw the matter back to steel and blood. "Then let us settle this on the battlefield." "Warriors," both commanders shouted, and the lines surged to life. "Destroy the human front lines. They have outlived their usefulness." At the Ronda war leader's command, nothing moved along the line. The alien troops held their positions, waiting for the encirclement to close, waiting for the human slaves to advance in futile defense, then to be cut down when the Xenos struck in unison. How many humans would die in the process mattered not a whit to them. Inside the defensive base, artillery never ceased. Batteries roared, lobbing shell after shell into the human approaches, a thunderous curtain that kept the enemy pinned. "Notify the other bases to abandon their front lines and reinforce us," Urien ordered the communications officer. He was consolidating his strength, sacrificing the two outlying positions to make a single, decisive stand against the invaders. Any scattered peripheral defenses were now pointless. The Randa were massing for an overwhelming blow. No longer content to trade shots along a stretched line, they intended to shatter the human formation with concentrated force. When the order went out, the Randa Titans moved. They broke from formation and surged forward to intercept the incoming reinforcements, their advance turning the battle toward the decisive clash Urien had planned. "God machines, to battle!" The voice of the Adeptus Mechanicus crackled over the comms. "The avatars of the Omnissiah will destroy the abominable creations of the Xenos." Behind the Imperial defensive line, the Titan's sirens screamed like warning horns, a challenge hurled right back at the alien engines. The Titan Legion, long poised for orders, began to stride forward. 10 Warlord Titans detached from their ranks, flanked by dozens of Reaver and Warhound Titans. Several massive Imperator Titans moved slower, bringing up the rear like living citadels. "Xeno mongrels, face my wrath," the Titan Princeps roared. His mind braided into the machine, becoming one with the metal colossus. Every thought and reflex fused to the war engine. Outnumbered though they were, the Imperial Titans chose to meet the enemy head-on, because honor, pride, and the dignity of the machine demanded nothing less. As if by tacit agreement, the Titan formations of both sides swung wide to the flanks, preparing for a decisive clash. The big engines opened the fight. Impatience overcame the foot soldiers. The Ronda elite warriors could not, or would not, wait for their human servitors. With a cry, they surged forward and launched their own assault. Human forces were formidable. They could not be allowed to regroup and inflict even greater losses. Along the entire defensive line, the Space Marines' cry rolled like thunder, "For the master of mankind!" Their voices carried absolute resolve. "For the Emperor!" came the response from the mortal auxiliary army as they rose and opened fire. Bolts and shells hammered the Xenos' lines, making their energy shields ripple under the onslaught. "Omnissiah!" replied the Adeptus Mechanicus Skitari, their tones calm but no less fervent. Different human factions, Space Marines, Auxiliaries, and Skitarii, welded themselves together into a single front against the alien assault. The Randa answered in kind. Their plasma rifles were devastating, fired in sustained volleys that cut down any warrior who failed to dodge in time. A single streak of blue plasma could punch clean through a Space Marine's power armor. Against ordinary mortals, it was nothing short of annihilation. Their war engines rolled forward in perfect formation, the energy shields of the machines shielding advancing infantry, while heavy laser batteries swept the battlefield, suppressing human tanks and emplacements. Only now, when the lines met in full force, did the Ronda reveal their true might. Their intent was plain: to crush human courage beneath an overwhelming, coordinated onslaught. For a time, the Imperial front line was a storm of flying projectiles. Energy beams met and canceled each other in blinding arcs. Bolter rounds thudded into Ronda warriors, and smaller volleys stitched the ground with smoke and shrapnel. But the true carnage was elsewhere. Where titans clashed, the battle was cataclysmic. The collision of those colossal machines shook the battlefield like an earthquake. Packs of warhound titans streaked along the flanks, their speed covering the lumbering giants and ripping into the enemy's lighter titans. Turbo-laser destructors, twin-linked and roaring, used that same speed to focus fire on the 15-meter class Xeno titans. Plasma blast guns spat death. Reavers tore into the fray, firing everything they had: Gatling blaster cannons, laser blasters, melta-cannons, making the enemy shields shudder under the onslaught. Warlord titans, each wielding massive single-handed melee weapons, strode forward through the debris, their void shields overlapping until they formed an even more resilient barrier. Even so, the Xeno-Titans' firepower was devastating. Their enormous plasma cannons hit with terrifying force. A Titan fighting alone would have its void shield overloaded almost instantly. That was why the Imperials held their lines and concentrated their weight. 6 Imperator Titans waited in the rear, each mounting a gargantuan earthquake cannon. They fired in coordinated pairs, and when the volleys struck the Xeno machines, whole Titans were torn apart in seconds. The earthquake cannons had been built to do one thing: drop colossal Xeno constructs with a single, searing shot. They'd never been used against Xeno Titans before, so the crews took no chances. Each pair of cannons fired in careful sequence, one after the other, to maximize lethality and minimize misfire. When the first salvo came, the Imperator Titans braced themselves, lowering their centers of gravity to absorb the brutal recoil. 6 deafening detonations rolled across the battlefield. Witness the wrath of the Titan, Xeno-twisted creations, filthy flesh machines. A voice bellowed over the comms as blinding beams lanced into the enemy. The first strikes threw the Randa Titan's defensive shields into overload. The follow-through rounds smashed through armor. One Randa Titan screamed as emerald energy, like viscous blood, spurted from the breach. It staggered, went to its knees, and then collapsed. 3 Xeno Titans fell instantly. The victory sent a jolt through the Imperials' lines, but it also drew furious attention. More Xeno Titans pivoted their shoulder-mounted plasma cannons and hammered at the Imperators, determined to take down the threat. A plasma bolt found its mark, punching into an Imperial Reaver's reactor. The breach ignited a violent secondary explosion that rocked the surrounding machines. A harsh, roaring siren cut through the chaos. From somewhere in the enemy ranks came a bestial cry: "I will tear you apart." The battle, far from over, pitched on, now with both sides escalating into the slaughter. A pure melee warlord surged forward, its power claw wreathed in crackling lightning as it tore a Xeno Titan limb from limb. It carried no long-range weapons, only that roaring fist, so its footfalls were thunderous, yet it moved with an almost unnerving swiftness, slipping between enemy lines, striking and pulling apart anything that got in its way. A steady rhythm of muffled thuds echoed across the battlefield. The warhounds, darting and slashing in tandem, kept up the pressure. Their coordinated strikes were devastating. One by one, the enemy Titans went down. Chapter 186, The Primarch Has Arrived, thanks to Angel CL for finding typos. The cost was horrific. Within a dozen minutes, more than half of the Titan Legion's Warhound Titans lay shattered, a slaughter beyond measure. God machines toppled in relentless struggle, locked axle to axle with the enemy as terrifying weapons spat death. Energy beams lanced the air, solid projectiles tore through plating, and each fall rang out like a new catastrophe. Then a warlord went down. Several plasma batteries struck at once. Its void shield overloaded and collapsed. a searing energy stream burned through its hull and detonated the reactor. Even the machine throne was reduced to twisted scrap. As the fight dragged on, the Imperial Titan's advantage crumbled beneath the sheer weight of Xenos' numbers. Wave after wave of enemy war automatons bore down until one Titan legion, already bloodied, found itself facing over 100 Xenos Titans and simply could not sustain the fight. The battle for Titan was hell made real. Steel behemoths and living monsters locked together in a storm of fire, oil, and corrosive ichor raining down around them. On the Imperial front, Urian stood at the tip of the spear, personally rallying men and meeting the Randan assault head-on. Dreadnoughts woke with grinding metal, every Terminator suit on the field moved out, and still they could not stop the tide. Tens of thousands of Randan crashed through bolter storms and heavy ordnance, swarming the walls themselves. They broke the outer defenses and poured into the front lines, cutting down the mortal auxiliary army in a slaughter that left no quarter. In barely 10 minutes, Urian lost contact with 5,000 of his brothers. Experienced legionaries, veterans of 100 campaigns, found themselves swarmed and ripped apart by Xenos overlords. The First Legion was being ground down by sheer numbers. The fight had become a rout. Watching his battle brothers fall by the score, Urian felt something break in him. Anger, grief, and a bitter, helpless fury. Then his eyes met those of the Randan overlord across the ruin. For a heartbeat, the world narrowed to the two of them, the looming, alien figure and the armored man who could not bear to wait, could not afford to wait, for the Primarch or reinforcements. There would be no orderly retreat, no last reserves to tide them over. Urian threw himself forward. He met the Overlord head-on, not for strategy, but for honor. If he was to die, he would do so by steel and in defiance. With a roar he charged, determined to take that monstrous commander down with him, or be torn apart trying. Urian was about to charge when the Randan army suddenly pulled back like a tide, reforming their lines. A calm, authoritative voice crackled over the comms. "Grandmaster Urian, you seem a bit impatient." Doom recognized that voice, the great Primarch, and he also knew the Grand Master of the First Legion had used unsavory methods to force this engagement. On the comms, Urian's reply was choked and trembling. "Great Primarch, I beg your forgiveness." Tears glistened in his voice. He craned his neck, and through the smoke and haze of battle, pale ranks of warships were becoming visible. A blue flagship led them as they poured out of the warp and into real space, one after another. Doom's fleet had arrived in the Morse star system earlier than expected, an anomaly he couldn't immediately explain. From his own perspective, the transit had been routine, 60 days in the warp. Sophia had ordered the fleet to prepare for combat 3 days beforehand. Yet when they cross-checked the timestamps, the First Fleet had actually materialized a few days ahead of schedule. He had no time to dwell on the mystery. More urgent matters waited. First, gather the forces. Drive back the Xenos. Afterwards, we will deal with everything else. Doom set aside any other matters for now. The battle had only just begun. As you command. The Grand Master's voice cracked with gratitude. Tears brimmed in his eyes. The Primarch's word was law. If Doom had ordered him to die, he would have obeyed without question. Then, with a roar that cut through the clash of weapons, he lifted his longsword and charged back into the Randan ranks. "Everyone, the Primarch has arrived. Slay the Xenos!" The Primarch's presence electrified the Imperial lines. There was no news more heartening than a Primarch in the field, and the soldiers surged forward with renewed ferocity. Beyond them, the Randan fleet swarmed, intent on annihilating the warships attempting to enter the system. Their numbers were overwhelming. Doom did not flinch. He knew their strength did not lie in mass alone, but in the technological edge of their vessels. He refused to be baited into a reckless full-system clearance. Instead, he drew a firm line in space, a defensive perimeter that claimed roughly 1/3 of the star system, with the world of Morse at its core. They would methodically secure that sector first, consolidate their hold, and then drive the Randan from their entrenched positions throughout the system. The First Fleet, 100 capital ships, accompanied by scores of destroyers and frigates, broke off from the main armada and swept toward the combat zone King Nawick had designated. Doom sat motionless on his command throne, barking orders without pause. "Main cannon ready. "Fire on the battle moon," he ordered. "Fleet, scatter. Destroy enemy warships, cover the landing craft, and deploy troops to Morse." The forward gun ports of the Royal Majesty opened, revealing the central axial main cannon as it began to charge, aimed squarely at the battle moon in Morse's orbit. "Dimensional conduit open, penetrating enemy shields," reported Iron Man Gates, the ship's systems AI, its status feed locked on the main battery. A pale blue filament lanced from the cannon's muzzle, like a needle piercing a soap bubble, and slipped through the battle moon's layered shields. The Randan were stunned. The human reinforcements behaved nothing like the intelligence had predicted. "Attack! Attack! Stop the humans!" The Xeno commander roared, and seeing their shields compromised, ordered a massive artillery barrage aimed at the humans' enormous flagship. In an instant, lance beams, plasma bursts, and a storm of accelerated projectiles slammed into the Royal Majesty. Every weapon on the hemisphere facing the human warship opened up. The volume of fire was enough to shred an asteroid, and after a long, blistering flight it struck the Royal Majesty's shields, only to be swallowed by the dimensional field and disappear. "Molecular disintegration cannon fully charged and ready," Gates announced. The disc-shaped head of the synthetic AI tilted, as if looking up at Doom, waiting for his command. "Destroy the Xenos creation," Doom ordered without hesitation. "Understood." Gates's cold, synthetic voice carried a note of something like eagerness as he pressed the fire control on the holographic console. There was no deafening report, no huge shockwave, only a focused outpouring of energy. A brilliant white stream of particles poured from the main cannon, channeled through the dimensional conduit and streaking toward the Xenos battle moon. The beam looked almost beautiful, a comet-like tail arcing across the void. Watching the humans mount such a spectacular offensive, unleashing that high-energy particle stream, the Randan Overlord found, to its own surprise, that it was no longer nervous. An energy strike of that magnitude should never have been able to breach the battle moon's outer armor, yet the devastation on the main display proved otherwise. A piercing alarm cut through the Xenos command center at the moment of impact. "Overlord, the battle moon is being destroyed," Randan reported. On the holographic projection, a glowing scar widened and ate away at the surface, the area of destruction growing in fast, hungry circles. The Overlord slammed a fist against the console, white smoke curling from the seams of its bioarmor as it bellowed in fury. "What is this? Why wasn't this in our intelligence?" Its voice ricocheted off the tape amber walls. From orbit, the strike tore a crimson ring across the battle moon's face. It was the work of a molecular disintegration cannon, a relic from the Golden Age. The weapon released a specific field or particle beam that initiated a cascading collapse of the target's molecular bonds. Once triggered, that collapse propagated like falling dominoes, disintegrating everything inside the affected area. Organic tissue, alloys, even entire starships, reduced to elementary particles or inert dust. It was one of the star-destroying armaments carried by the Royal Majesty. Once the disintegration effect struck a target, it did not stop until that object had been reduced to nothing and could no longer initiate any sort of chain reaction. On Morse, Grandmaster Urian, locked in brutal combat with the Randan, suddenly felt the planet tilt, however slightly, beneath his feet. He looked up. The battle moon that hung in orbit was being eaten away by some vast weapon. Chunks of it winked out, its mass visibly diminishing. "Look," someone cried. "The Primarch has destroyed the Xenos space station. They crumble before the Emperor's son." "For the Emperor!" Urian roared, and a well of inexhaustible strength poured through him as he hurled himself into the enemy ranks. The air around the battlefield dropped in temperature. Psychic lightning danced across the front lines and then detonated into a blinding flare. From that flare stepped 100 towering figures, born of teleportation light, golden armor flashing, helmets crested with red plumes, cloaks whipping in the scarred air. Urian froze for an instant, stunned. The Custodes, the Emperor's own sentinels, had appeared where none had been expected. Before he could gather his thoughts, those same guardians, halberds and greatswords in hand, surged forward to cut into the Randan. Like a thunderstorm, like an autumn wind sweeping fallen leaves, the Golden Warriors struck with impossible speed. In the blink of an eye, they crashed through the Randan battle line, cutting down Xenos as casually as butchers slaying swine. In only 2 exchanges, the Randan overlord was cleft into pieces beneath the Custodes' blades. "The Emperor!" cried the auxiliary troops, mortal bodies trembling. If it had not been for the sweep of battle, they would have fallen to their knees. The Custodes were the Emperor's living will, legendary warriors of myth whom most men only ever heard of in stories, rarely, if ever, fortunate enough to see. A custodian shield captain loomed before the Grand Master and said his name, the greeting flat and cold, Urian Bendegard. He looked down at Urian without a flicker of emotion. "I am commanded by Primarch Doom Novik to assist you in battle. What do you require?" Under any other circumstances, Urian would have declined on principle. There was no time for principle now. He pointed toward the shattered horizon, where the Titan Legion clung to the fight. Only 3 warlord Titans still moved, and they were all but spent. The Xenos Titans. The Primarch has his own arrangements. The shield captain gave the Grandmaster a quick look, then looked away. The destroyer warriors will take care of them. He raised a hand and pointed toward the heavens. "Atlantis Mecca," he said, nodding for the Grand Master to look up. "They're here." Far above, 10 massive shapes tore through the upper atmosphere, their hulls lighting as they hit the air. Trails of fire and ionized plasma streamed behind them as they fell, glowing beacons plunging down toward the Titan battlefield. Chapter 189, Atlantis Mecca. The mechanical sarcophagus streaked through the atmosphere like a falling star, its shell ablaze in orange-red flames from friction. Inside, the steel giant trembled awake. Subsystems came to life in a precise sequence, linking one by one into the main neural control network. Ra stood in the cockpit, clad in gleaming golden armor. He stood on a suspended platform surrounded by a circular field simulator, where simulacra of terrain rose and fell in light and shadow, shifting sheets of metal and projected ground forming valleys, ridges, and sky. A haze of dense, nanometer-scale sensory receivers drifted across the surface of his armor, translating every micro-movement of the operator into data for the mecha's neural sensors. "Neural operating system connected," the superintelligent core announced, its voice clinical and steady, synchronizing with Atlantis system. Ra felt his sense of self thin and spread outward. His mind slid into a space of cold logic and pure numbers, an architecture of processes and rational pathways. "Hello, operator." The greeting landed like an echo in the hollow of his consciousness, familiar and oddly interrogative at once. For a moment, the 2 minds tested one another. Ra's resilient will, unyielding and human, reached out and found purchase on the mecha's clinical clarity. The bridge held. His intent fused with the machine's reasoning, and the steel giant rose fully awake, its pilot and its system operating as one. He felt his thoughts multiply and extend into a body of cold steel, a vessel humming with raw power. A calm voice greeted him, no strain, no pressure. "Hello, Atlantean." The Atlantis mecha's intelligence was far beyond a simple machine. Its systems freed the operator's mind instead of demanding constant attention. It was like the relationship between a human brain and its body. The brain thinks and decides, while the body obeys autonomously. Compared with the Empire's Titans, Nur's Atlantis mecha had a much more advanced operating system and far more intuitive controls. Synchronization complete. Ra's consciousness shivered with instinct as it settled and aligned. His awareness threaded through the mecha. Our wills are one. With a thunderous crack, the mechanical sarcophagus split open in midair, and the giant humanoid form within unfolded. The mecha peered down with an almost human gesture, knees slightly bent, as if bracing for a landing. Brace for impact. Deploy the foot dispersal force field. The thought flashed through him, and the synchronized neural operating system executed it in nanoseconds. Ra floated in midair, wrapped in a lattice of nanoscopic sensory filaments. The system gently compressed his body, generating tactile resistance that mirrored the mecha's sensors. Through that feedback, the pilot could fully synchronize with the Atlantean unit, experiencing its surroundings as if they were his own and making the same split-second judgments. Thump, 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 thump. The ground shuddered as 10 Atlantis mechas touched down, kicking up a sky-high cloud of dust as they crashed into the battlefield where Titans were already clashing. The Randan biomechas fell back, regrouping to face the human reinforcements. The tide of the ground battle had turned. Humanity had destroyed the battle moon and blockaded Morse World's orbit. Until the outcome of the space engagement was decided, no further reinforcements could arrive. 100 Randan Titan machines quickly withdrew to more advantageous positions, their weapons beginning to charge. When the dust finally settled, those towering humanoid machines rose again, massive, imposing, and utterly majestic as they prepared to fight. "By the Omnissiah!" the members of the Adeptus Mechanicus cried out, and then, upon seeing the 100-meter-tall figures, their normally clipped mechanical voices broke into a trembling chant. "Omnissiah! Omnissiah!" The cloaked steel colossi loomed over them, and the red-robed tech priests sank to their knees, offering binary hymns of praise. The sight arrested Urian and the custodian guards. Even they paused, eyes fixed on the humanoid machines with a hard, almost envious light. No matter the age or the number of their modifications, men found it difficult to resist the cold, exact beauty of finely wrought machinery. To stand inside such a towering engine, to pilot it, was an aspiration that stirred something primeval in them. The Atlantis mecha rose 100 meters into the sky, shoulder-mounted cannons bristling like siege engines. Its head was oddly human in outline, but crowned with two horn-like protrusions, a design that married classical lines to bestial menace. From its speakers came a clear, disdainful transmission. "Titans, withdraw. This place is ours." The voice was strange, part human inflection, part metallic growl, as if flesh and gear had learned to speak as one. It was a sound that carried both ownership and a promise of ruin. "Thank you for the rescue. Here is the intelligence on the Xenos." The Warlord Titan captain acknowledged the machines that had descended from the sky and relayed the enemy data. The skyborne units, their hulls scarred and their systems smoking, turned away from the clearing and began to withdraw, confident, despite their wounds, that the field was now in capable hands. With war engines this large, it wasn't a question of whether they could win so much as how they would win. Bigger was better. Ra pivoted to face the Xenos. The Atlantis mecha mirrored him perfectly, its enormous frame rising and falling in time with his breath. Cloaked against sensors and towering 100 meters high, the machine hefted a gargantuan dimensional weapon and swept it down toward the Xenos formation. The Randan Titan cluster sensed the threat at once. Every one of their machines locked its targeting optics on the Atlantis mecha. Warning sirens began to wail. Finally, one Randan pilot snapped. He drove a colossal bio-armor suit forward in a desperate charge at the human machine. "Humph." The Atlantean, Ra, issued a human, guttural roar. He ignited the dimensional halberd in the mech's hands, dragging its blade along the ground to gouge deep furrows, then surged forward to meet the Randan and the Xenos Titans head-on. To the disbelief of everyone watching, the 100-meter-tall humanoid machine broke into a run. "Oh, Messiah! Only such a body can be your great incarnation." The Adeptus Mechanicus priests and tech priests cried, voices trembling. They stood motionless as their data streams and augmetic feeds began to stutter and glitch. Something was corrupting their sensors. "Our weapons can't lock onto the humanoid mecha." Inside the Randan Titan, the operators cursed as their targeting displays failed to get a lock. Alarms blinked uselessly. Every attempt to fix the solution was interrupted by noise that crawled through the channels. The horns on the Atlantis mecha's head, it turned out, were not mere ornamentation. They functioned as massive antennae, targeting disruptors, emitting a distinctive electromagnetic waveform that wrapped the whole machine and scrambled enemy tracking. The ground shuddered with each colossal step. The Atlantis mecha's movements sent violent sonic booms rippling out from the tips of its limbs. At that scale, the smallest rotation at a joint became an enormous, fast sweep at the extremity. Ra surged forward, sensing only the planet's crust trembling under him as he danced the halberd through a practiced twirl. Then he jumped. Ra leapt inside the cockpit's neural interface, and the Atlantis mecha leapt in the real world. The plasma reactor screamed to life, channeling raw power into millions of artificial muscle fibers. The Atlantean answered like a living thing, its frame coiling, then launching. With its foot stabilizers disengaged, it tore free of the ground and drove a jump kick straight into a 50-meter Randan Titan. A dull, bone-shattering thud rolled across the battlefield. A visible shockwave rippled outward as the Titan's Xenos shield overloaded, Its chest bioarmor exploded inward, and the giant folded, amid down, and rolled like a beaten animal. It struggled uselessly, unable to right itself. Ra twisted in the cockpit with fluid precision and brought the halberd around in a horizontal arc, cleaving another Xenos Titan in two. The Atlantean moved with agility that belied its bulk, a towering giant dispatching enemy war machines with terrifying ease. The slightly smaller Randon Titans weren't even worth deploying the destroyer warrior's heavy ordnance for. They were simply too insignificant. The 15-meter light models tried to use their speed to harass, but the Atlanteans' steel-footed stomps crushed them like insects. The 30-meter mediums fared no better. A single monstrous kick sent them spinning kilometers through the air, disintegrating before they hit the ground. 10 Atlantean mechas cut through the battlefield like a hurricane. They utterly dominated 100 Randon Titans without even bringing their shoulder-mounted heavy cannons online. Their mobility was terrifying. An Atlantean's stride was faster than a Randon could twist its upper body. This was not a contest between equals. A soft cape hung from each Atlantean's back, woven from light-diffusing material. It threw up illusions of light and shadow that blurred the machine's real motions. The swinging halberd moved like water, its strikes surrounded by multiple feints that left the Xenos guessing how to evade. When the dimensional halberd or the great axe connected, shields and armor meant nothing. Each clean strike wrecked a Titan and killed its pilot. Sirens screamed across the field. "Human, take this!" one Rondon bellowed, followed by a hysteric war cry. "Feel the vengeful wrath of my race." Several Titans then sacrificed themselves to obtain clear visual locks, exposing their torsos so their shoulder-mounted plasma cannons could roar in a thunderous double volley, an ugly, furious bid for revenge. Ra merely sneered at their impotent fury. He didn't bother to raise his shield. Within nanoseconds, his systems calculated the incoming firing trajectories. He shifted a fraction to the side, and the 100-meter war machine danced clear of the plasma cannon blast. "How is that possible?" the Randon cried, stunned. The firing window they had won through sacrifice had been negated by a single, almost insignificant movement. "Nothing is impossible," Ra replied, voice dripping with contempt. His dimensional halberd swept through the air and cleaved the exposed Titan in two. Its reactor detonated in a blinding, metal-shredding bloom. "You have just seen a power beyond your imagining, and your minds refuse to accept it." Within 5 minutes of landing, most of the Xenos Titans lay wrecked. The few survivors were sprawled on the ground, their systems failing, unable to rise. With the drop zone secured, Ra planted the great halberd point first and called up the transport on the comms. "Release the mortal Titans. Clear to land." Massive mechanical thrones descended from the sky, lowering Nur's Auxiliary Army's Titan units onto the battlefield. Chapter 188. Nur Auxiliary Army. The Nur Mortal Auxiliary Army, fielding its own Titans, had grown out of an offshoot of Atlantean technology that took a very different direction. Where the Atlantean Titans had been designed for speed and close-quarters Titan duels, the Mortal Titans favored long-range firepower. Entirely crewed and maintained by mortals, their technological line, after several iterations, developed into a distinct branch of warfare, separate from the Night Watch and the Destroyer Warrior. 100 custodes blinked into the arena, the Blade Champion at their forefront. Among the custodes, those bearing the title Champion were naturally the most formidable, each armed with gargantuan power swords. The Blade Champion cut through the enemy ranks with unstoppable force. Alien overlords toppled one after another beneath his strikes. Occasional stray shots from enemy plasma cannons struck the custodes, but the flashes were caught and quenched by their wavering dimensional shields. The protective barriers held, and the warriors within remained unscathed. An old Terran proverb applied perfectly to the scene. He who eats from another's hand is beholden to them. The gifts Nur had bestowed on these superhuman fighters, not least the advanced shielding and enhancements, multiplied their combat effectiveness several times over. The custodes welcomed the gesture, and on the field it showed. They fought with even greater vigor. "Abominations, face the wrath of the master of mankind," the Blade Champion bellowed, thrown entirely into the fury of combat as he swung his seemingly cumbersome greatsword with uncanny precision. Custodes rarely displayed strong emotion. Their minds were calm and ruthlessly efficient. The Blade Champion was different. As the Emperor's fiercest warrior, he needed to unleash that raw, furious heat on the enemy. Every strike was surgical, every angle calculated. Each swing felled several of the aliens at once. The Randan frontline wavered, repeatedly buckling and then reforming. Under the Custodes' charge, the unprepared Randan army, tens of thousands of elite warriors, could not mount any effective counterattack. Seizing the moment, Urien redeployed the Imperial line, hardening the defenses and preparing to meet the next onslaught. As Grandmaster and Commander, he knew all too well that the Custodes' charge and the Titans' success were only temporary reprieves. If the Randan learned to counter the Custodes' tactics, the golden-clad warriors could be in danger of being surrounded. Urien had no right to question how a Primarch arrayed the Custodes, so he set aside his doubts and set about reorganizing the Imperial defensive line. Even with a Primarch present and the Custodes helping to steady the front, his duty was to make sure the line held. He noted that the Randan's mortal servants had already slipped away, falling back to the rear of the Hive City to regroup. Barring surprises, the coming engagement would be a grinding war of attrition. Imperial legions, ensure your safety, a grand voice boomed as Urien deployed his troops. Watch what's over your heads. When he looked up, he understood why. A vast Atlantis mecha, having finished with the alien Titans, had thundered to the edge of the battlefield and now loomed between the two armies. The machine was large enough to blot out the sun. At the sound and sight of it, the Custodes who had been charging broke off their assaults and fell back with astonishing speed. The Randan elite, who moments before had been advancing without hesitation, stood staring upward in dumbfounded silence as the great shadow fell across the field. The sector was protected by a shield that rendered Titan weaponry almost useless. The Randan Titans could only stand and watch. They didn't even have time to warn one another before the golden-armored human Titans struck, their weapons somehow piercing the barrier. A towering human mecha raised its giant halberd. Inside the cockpit, Law smiled. The feeling of crushing ants was deliciously satisfying. The Tlantan brought the weapon down with brutal force, spraying mud and blood and gouging a deep trench in the ground. With a wide horizontal sweep, the halberd cut through the Randan ranks like a scythe through wheat, leaving bodies in its wake and stunning both the Imperial defensive line and the Randan war leader. The mecha dropped to one knee and swept the halberd back and forth, shredding formations, sending the field into chaos as screams rang out everywhere. "Run!" The Randan elite warriors shrieked, abandoning their positions and fleeing desperately toward the human Hive City at the rear. Nothing could stay calm when a towering giant struck. Morale shattered. Their formation collapsed as the 6 omnidirectional legs of their bio-armor churned and they fled for the rear. La rose slowly, halberd in one hand, the other wiping clinging mud from the blade. He did not give chase. The Atlantis mecha's orders were clear. Hold the Empire's front and drive back the Randan, nothing more. Once the task was done, the mecha hauled together the wreckage of the alien Titans and incinerated the remains. A Primarch's command left no room for debate. The Randan were an inscrutable species. Any of their constructs had to be annihilated to prevent future peril. The Adeptus Mechanicus priests watched with tight faces as plasma licked the alien hulls. There had been elements in those machines worth studying, and it hurt them to see them reduced to slag. The moment passed. Nur's mortal Titans moved in next. 60 meters tall, left arms fixed with rapid-fire composite cannons, right arms crudely human in shape, but bristling with siege implements. They descended into the ruined plain like judgment, ready to consolidate the line and press whatever advantage remained. At the Titan engagement site, the mortal Titans had flattened the terrain to make room for the landings. The Randan were cowed, holed up inside the human Hive City with its gates welded shut, too afraid to venture out. This was a critical moment for humanity to regroup and show it still had teeth. Reinforcements were arriving. Dropships drifted down, and the Nur auxiliary army poured out in tight square formations, methodically establishing defensive positions around the landing zone. Urien watched them through his visor. Thanks to his Space Marine enhanced sight and the helmet's optical magnification, Every detail was crisp. A flicker of surprise crossed his face. These troops, raised on a Primarch's world, radiated strength just by standing there. They averaged over 1.9 meters tall, with thick, powerful builds, impeccable bearing, and fierce morale. Clad in full-body power armor that looked highly protective, they carried weapons that were solid and imposing, clearly capable weapons. Urien nodded to himself. He had seen many mortal auxiliary armies in his time. This one was unquestionably a formidable force. There were faint hints of inexperience in their formation, but one battle would be enough to harden them. Before the Grand Master could finish his lament, the next sight stunned him into silence. He knew the Nor worlds relied heavily on machinery and were permitted to field AI, but this exceeded every expectation. Towering machines of varied design strode at the front. Urien immediately recognized them as Iron Man-type AI units. Behind them, arrays of standardized automated soldiers poured out of the landing ships in tight square formations. Each automated soldier stood only about half the height of a human, built on 4 mechanical legs with a rectangular control unit on top and heavy-caliber weapons mounted around it. Their firepower was formidable, their design economical and efficient. 1 to 10, the Grand Master calculated in his head. Nor had put ashore 100,000 auxiliary army troops, supported by 1 million automated soldiers. As those waves of small automatons spread across the landing zone, several meter-tall mecha also emerged, stepping out and taking up neat positions at the touchdown point. A large contingent of engineering equipment had already landed and begun erecting barracks and defenses, everything needed to prepare for a protracted fight with the aliens. In orbit, Doom was directing the fleet. There was no room for complacency. The Randan counterattack was relentless, hammering at the picket line he had drawn and trying to break through to reach Morse. Nur's ships kept driving the Randan back and shoring up the line, but the First Fleet was heavily outnumbered. The fleet had to split its support across multiple sectors as the Randan probed from different vectors, searching for weak points. Primarch, a transmission came through, voiced with the utmost reverence. Doom's face showed no emotion. He kept the solemn bearing of a Primarch, though inwardly he allowed himself a measure of relief. An hour after the First Fleet arrived, the First Legion's task force made contact, just in time. Doom gave a slight tilt of his chin and asked, with a faintly condescending edge, "How many ships do you still have, Lord of the Heavenly Host?" "Reporting, Primarch." The Lord of the Void Sky Army spoke with the solemn bearing expected before a Primarch, careful not to sound either flippant or fearful. "Our fleet has not suffered major losses. The formation is intact." "Very good." Doom's approval was quiet but firm. Inwardly, he allowed himself a small, private satisfaction. Urien's disposition was sound. Preserving his strength was the right call. The Lord bowed his head, careful not to overreach or excuse the Grand Master's choices. Doom tapped the holographic display, tracing several strategic sectors. "Split your fleet," he ordered. "Use 3 Gloriana Queens as the core and hold these areas." "Your command will be obeyed." The Lord snapped to attention, fist to chest in the warrior's salute reserved for the warrior king. "The First Legion will not let a single Xenos escape." Doom inclined his head at the vow, acknowledging the resolve. Then, more sharply, he added, "Do not be reckless. Do not repeat past mistakes." At the Primarch's warning, the Lord of the Void Sky Army's body trembled. His power armor groaned as he straightened, every movement suddenly heavier with the weight of command. "The First Legion will not disappoint you," he vowed, dropping to one knee and bowing his head before the Primarch. "Hurry. Enter the battlefield." Doom issued the final command, dismissed the holographic projection, and turned his focus back to the grand strategy. Chapter 189, City Breaker. "Sir, and Xeno transmission is coming through," Sophia said, appearing at the command throne and speaking quietly. "Shall I patch it in?" Doom nodded, eyes narrowing. The Randan message had arrived at a delicate moment, neither too early nor too late. The Imperial fleet had just entered the fight, and the ground war was going badly. He wanted to hear what the Xeno had to say. "Connect it," he ordered. Then, after a beat, "obscure the bridge in my image." "Understood." With a casual flick of her pale hand, Sophia enacted the concealment. All external sensors saw only the Imperial Aquila. The bridge and Doom himself were masked from the feed. The incoming transmission resolved into a single grotesque figure, a floating, dark green brain with gleaming golden eyes and an ugly, leering face, a mass of slick tentacles writhing beneath it. The caption identified it as War Leader Lolos of Randan. He showed no bioarmor. Lolos's voice came through slow and deliberate, laced with a psychic smear intended to needle and provoke. "Human, do you not dare to face your opponent?" he taunted. "I did not expect you to be such a coward. Humans really are inferior." Doom's voice, processed and cold as ice that had never thawed, cut through the comms. "Enough with the crude taunts, Xeno," came the snarled reply. "You want to look at me? To send the Imperium's hounds to spy on my face?" Doom continued, each word deliberate. "I never thought of you as opponents, just ugly Xenos, scum to be cleansed by lances of light." The moment the fleet made contact with Urian, the Grand Master forwarded the intelligence without hesitation. Doom's tone had been measured on purpose. He wanted Lolos to know he was aware of traitors inside the Imperium. It was a probe aimed at Randan to gauge how much the Xenos actually knew. They had no idea about the Nor fleet's internal intelligence. What they did know was that Doom himself had taken part in the expedition, that the Imperium had dispatched the First Legion, even the exact troop numbers, and that a trap had been laid here. If someone else, one of his other brothers, had led the force today instead of him, the engagement would not have been nearly so straightforward. Leaked Imperial intelligence had given the Randan warriors detailed data on Imperial equipment, allowing them to prepare for a carefully planned assault. Even so, the First Legion's strength remained obvious. Although their technical secrecy had been shattered, the Legion still traded blows with the Randan in the field and left the Xenos bleeding, casualty ratios that would have been catastrophic for any other Legion. Had a lesser force faced the same leak, the ground troops would have paid many times more dearly. "Indeed," Lolos announced without hesitation, even using his name. "There are traitors within the Imperium of Man gathering information on you, Doom Novik." Doom's interest flickered at the mention of his name, but his tone was dry with sarcasm. "How convenient. Then hurry up. While you've learned some things about me, you still know very little. You know almost nothing about the fleet and technological strength of the Nor worlds," Lolos replied, tentacles twitching as if tasting the air. His sensors had picked up the critical reference to the Nor worlds and registered its importance. Lolos's face gave no sign of expression. He had no cheeks to move, but there was a cold, inward contempt behind his calm. Lolos sneered inwardly. The Primarch on the other end, a superhuman who'd clearly let victory go to his head, had just let something important slip. Behind the Primarch's hollow image, Doom's lips curled into a cold, almost predatory smile. The truth was brutal and simple. Information about the Nor worlds was locked in the Imperial archives at the highest secrecy. The Custodian Guard kept the seal, and fewer than 100 officials across the entire Imperium were authorized to view those records. Whoever had access to the Nor files recently had to be an insider. That made it a trap. The data could only have come from a traitor inside the Imperium, someone under Randan's control. If Randan had worked that out and still refused to abandon its mole, if it was willing to go to extraordinary lengths to target the Nor worlds, then so be it. The possibility fit the facts, and Lolos let his mind catalog it coldly, pleased at the misstep the Primarch had made. He changed the subject with an abruptness meant to disarm. "I have a proposal," Lolos said, voice smooth over the comms. "My race will withdraw from this star system and relinquish control of it. We will cease hostilities with humanity and undertake not to expand into this star sector again." The Primarch's reply was venomous. "Has something gone wrong with your slick, filthy brain?" he snapped. Even as the barb left his mouth, the Primarch knew why the Xenos had shifted topics. He knew they were trying to bury whatever had been revealed under an offer that smelled of calculation. He even knew, with a professional distrust that was almost boredom, that the proposal might be genuine. But in a war where information could be a weapon and every word a ruse, sincerity and deceit stood on the same battlefield. That knowledge made the offer no less dangerous and no less useful. Doom snapped, "Shake hands and make peace? Does Randan even have a brain?" "Get lost, you psionic manipulating Xeno," he he spat, waving a hand in disgust. Sophia cut the calm. He couldn't tell whether Randon was truly foolish or just playing the part. But after everything they had learned about Randon's psionic contamination and mind control, there was no room for diplomacy. The Imperium of Man had to eliminate the Randon threat, root and branch. If they let up now, if they reached out in friendship, it would only be a matter of time before Randon's psionic agents wormed into every level of human society, and the human race was enslaved from within. The earlier decision to abandon the Morse system had been no sign of weakness, only a temporary concession. It was meant to spare tens of thousands of elite Randon warriors, the Xenos' mid-tier fighting force, from total annihilation. Those losses would never have been accepted by the Randan themselves, and the Imperium, for all its iron will, would not casually abandon an entire legion. Doom pushed back from the briefing table, shaking his head as he keyed the tactical display. The defensive line had to hold. He concentrated on the plans for repelling any surprise strike. The Randan fleet massed like a living thing in the chemo system, enormous, dense, and ready. The Xenos had come to Morse World intending to hunt a Primarch, Doom or one of his brothers, and to crush a legion of the Imperium. They had committed a vast force to that single objective. But the situation had turned against them. The Randan warriors stranded on Morse had become an unexpected and dangerous liability. Had those warriors not been trapped, the Randan fleet could have disengaged long ago. Instead, the fleet was pinned, repeatedly hammering the human blockade in desperate attempts to recover its kin and preserve its elite fighting force. With their plan frustrated, Morse World had lost its value to the Randans. The sooner they withdrew, the better. Doom paid no attention to the day-to-day struggle on the surface. The slow, grinding tactic he had ordered, what some called slicing meat with a dull knife, was meant to be carried out by others. The Randan contingent on Morse had to be annihilated. Whether that destruction came slowly or swiftly would make all the difference to the wider campaign. On the ground, Doom's will was executed by a Legion warrior named Atom. One of the original 10 warriors and among the first to attend the War College, Atom had a fierce, studied interest in the art of war. Doom trusted him implicitly. Atom stood in the fortress command room, not daring to relax for a single moment. He carried the expectations of his gene father on his shoulders. The Primarch wanted the Destroyer warriors to be more than mere bruisers, versatile leaders, not just instruments of slaughter. On a great battlefield, a single superhuman could perform extraordinary feats, but he could not be relied upon to change the outcome of a long, complex engagement unless he could break through an enemy's defenses and personally slay its commander. For that reason, the Primarch demanded that every Destroyer warrior also be capable of commanding armies, no less than 1 million troops. Atom had taken charge of the mortal forces. He would lead that 1 million-strong host against the Hive City occupied by Randan. The command room was vast and formal. Along with Atom stood other Destroyer warriors in black plate and the Custodian Guard in their burnished gold. A handful of Iron Men lingered at the far side of the chamber, exchanging reports and arguing over the nature of the Randan threat, especially the disturbing reports of a mysterious psychic control. They did not make the operational decisions, but they were stationed there, fully prepared to move at a moment's notice. La whispered into his comm, calling his brother and issuing the combat order. Can the Atlantis mecha weapons take out the Hive City's power reactors? To cow the Xenos, we have to shatter their protective umbrella, Atom added. Yes, La answered, the confirmation warming something like joy in Atom's chest. But it's forbidden, his brother added. You know why. Understood. Atom nodded and began thinking of alternatives. The Gene Father had strictly banned the use of special units and even psychic transmission when testing his progeny. He wanted them to capture the Hive City using only standard Nor armament. With those limits, Atom swallowed his eagerness and waited for the auxiliary army's equipment to land. Then we'll wait for the gear to arrive. The Gene Father controlled the campaign and was in no hurry to annihilate the Randan army. He had insisted on a slow, grinding tactic, the slicing meat with a dull knife approach. Against the Hive City's shields, Nor had its own methods for prying open an apparently unbreakable shell. As the star sank, the The combat hemisphere of Morse plunged into darkness, and the battlefield fell silent. Sparks lanced across the night sky as warships exploded one after another, but on the ground the fighting had gone quiet. The Randon had vanished into the Hive City, keeping their presence hidden. Their human auxiliaries were skirting the front, taking circuitous routes back to their own Hive strongholds. Autumn paid them little mind. Those servant armies would soon be boxed in. An army without defensive capability was simply prey, and the Nor auxiliary armory had enough weapons of mass destruction to make that prey irrelevant. "Sir, the City Breaker cannon is assembled," a mortal technician called, his voice alive with excitement. Adam stood, pushed away from the command console, and walked out of the fortress to watch the weapon in action. The cannon was monstrous, a barrel 100 meters across, mounted on super-heavy treads that hugged its flank. 4 plasma reactors crouched behind it, fed by energy conduits the thickness of trees, 10 meters in diameter, snaking power into the weapon. The hull itself stretched half a kilometer long. They had named it City Breaker, and its enormous muzzle pointed, dark and menacing, straight at the Hive City. Chapter 192, The Might of the Siege Breaker. The Siege Breaker's massive treads rumbled as the gaping behemoth inched into its assigned position. When it stopped, a 45-degree aperture opened at its front, creating a single, exclusive firing arc. There were many varieties of siege breakers, and this one's design reflected the brutal realities of fighting on the ground. The battlefield was no vacuum. You couldn't simply transplant a starship macro cannon and expect it to behave the same. This siege breaker's main cannon was not a conventional kinetic gun, because if it fired ultra-large solid slugs like a space macro cannon, the impact would wreck its own emplacement. Even a projectile traveling at 1/10 the speed of light, fired close to the surface, might punch through enemy shields and leave foes intact, but the force involved would absolutely destroy the siege breaker's firing position. "Warlord, everything's ready. We can fire on your command," a technician said, stepping forward and offering a data slate with a reverent bow. He was one of King Nawik's genetic scions, tall and imposing, bred in the image of the great ruler. Autumn accepted the slate. "Thank you." When the edge of his golden armor brushed the data slate, the suit's auxiliary AI parsed its contents instantly. In truth, no physical contact was necessary. A superintelligent chip had no trouble retrieving the file. But Autumn had taken the slate himself out of respect for the mortals and to honor the technician's labor. "Excellent," Adam said, nodding. "Your professionalism is superb. Your training was not wasted." It was an achievement worth praising. The Siege Breaker, a steel behemoth and gargantuan cannon, had been assembled by 10,000 technicians in 12 hours with not a single error. The technician who'd been singled out straightened, chest swelling with pride. "Thank you for your praise," he replied, standing at attention. Adam climbed the observation tower and looked down at the giant weapon below. Beyond it, the layered sprawl of the Hive City spread into the haze, and he let his gaze linger over the distance. "Fire!" he barked over the comms, ordering the technicians to unleash the siege breaker. "Tear down the Xenos' defenses. Let them fear every move humanity makes." "As you command, Lord." A low, electric buzz filled the air. The siege breaker's body trembled, and dust shivered from its barrel, drifting away in thin clouds. This vibrating siege breaker was one variant among many. Inside the cannon's cavernous muzzle, rows of microscopic vibration mechanisms arranged themselves with mechanical precision, sending out dense, high-frequency oscillations. As the frequencies synchronized, the weapon's containment field gathered them and projected a concentrated wave in the direction the cannon had been aimed. A humming swelled, then uncoiled like the slow exhale of some enormous beast, a white, translucent wave, nearly 100 meters thick. To the eye, it looked like a glitch on a high-definition screen, a sudden graininess, a tearing of the image that warped space and time. The vibrational wave shredded molecular bonds. Trillions of resonant pulses raced through the ground, ripping soil and rock apart and reducing matter into a shimmering cloud of free atoms. In an instant, the destructive front swept across tens of kilometers and slammed against the outer wall of the Hive City. The impact triggered the Hive's warp shield. The wall flared with a sickly warp light as the shield engaged, an energy field that, Rather than simply stopping fast-moving objects, teleports anything above a certain velocity into the warp, shunting it out of the real universe and protecting whatever lies beneath. Only weapons that already traverse dimensions, phase or dimensional arms, can penetrate a warp shield. Ordinary matter from the real universe cannot pass through. War leader Lolos of the Randon let out a relieved breath. The human slaves' shielding technology was undeniably superior to the Randon energy shields. This barrier had held when it counted. For a heartbeat, he allowed himself to relax. That relief evaporated almost instantly. The assault was not a single pulse, but a continuous beam. The vibrational wave did not fade. The human siege weapon kept hammering the shield with sustained energy. "It's over," Lolos thought, helpless and near despair. His head hammered, and his vision skimmed with nausea. He despised himself for leaving the orbital battleship and coming down to gamble everything on a decisive engagement with the human legion. After the battle moon was destroyed, he and the Randon elite had been stranded here, their only protection, the Hive City's human shield. The Siegebreaker's high-frequency vibration wave kept pounding the warp shield, each strike throwing up bursts of purple light. Under the relentless assault, the shield changed, no longer an insubstantial shimmer, but a visible, quivering membrane. The vibration cannon yanked and stretched that energy skin, setting off a catastrophic resonance, the likes of which no one had seen. For a moment, the whole theater fell silent. Imperial and Nerve forces alike turned to stare at the Hive City as the semi-transparent shield began to glow, its warp radiance spreading outward from the point of impact until it bathed the entire hemisphere. The brightness swelled, a luminous half-moon hanging impossibly low, and Morse's night was flooded in an eerie, otherworldly light. The warp shield flared brighter and brighter, beautiful in the instant before it broke. A tragic radiance so intense it could be admired from orbit. For 20 minutes it had held under continuous assault, until at last the Siegebreaker cannon's vibration wave pushed it past its limits. Resonance was not like an orbital bombardment. It was a sustained, grinding attack that drained far more energy from the shield. One was a steady hammering, the other a brief, violent blow. They could not be compared. Then, with a final shuddering crack, the shield overloaded. The vibration wave of the Siegebreaker hit the Hive City wall, and, in less than 1/100th of a second, tore through dozens of meters of stone and reinforced structure. The wave could not be stopped, its high-frequency oscillations unmade matter at the molecular level. People had no time to react. The human slaves sheltering behind the walls were instantaneously reduced to molecular dust by the wave's destructive frequencies. The Randon elite warriors fared no better. Their so-called biological armor offered no more protection than ordinary flesh and blood. Where the vibration wave passed, anything nearby was reduced to dust. Farther out, objects detonated in violent, cascading explosions. Freed from its containment field, the high-frequency oscillations spread unchecked, and wherever the frequencies met the right conditions, it induced catastrophic fission. A ribbon of fire lanced through the Hive City as nuclear blasts erupted, and matter, stone, steel, flesh, and blood, was shredded down to molecular dust by the reverberations. The wave rolled on, cutting through every shield and defensive measure until it struck the plasma reactor at the city's core. Boom! The reactor blew apart in a cataclysmic explosion, collapsing 1/3 of the city's structures. When the flames died back, the skyline was a smear of smoke, and a darkened, half-ruined Hive City remained. A thunderous cheer rose from the Imperial position. Space Marines and mortals alike roared their triumph, the long-suppressed fury of being besieged by Xenos finally pouring out in a single release. Urian took off his helmet, a smile breaking across his face. The gloom that had hung over him vanished. With the Xenos' shields down, they were exposed, like a flock without a fold, bracing for the Imperial fist to fall at any moment. He stared at the siege weapon sprawled on the ground, stunned by its sheer power, and began to run the numbers in his head. If the First Legion fielded machines like this, it would be unbeatable. He had to find a way to acquire a few. He drew a slow breath, thinking of the Legion's advantage. Thou, Gatch, he bore the stigma of a crime. He still had duties to weigh. The Primarch had not yet condemned him, and he remained the Legion's Grand Master. A voice crackled over his comm. Brother, Urien Bendigard. He couldn't ignore it. Snapping his helmet back on, he opened the channel and answered, Brother Atum, greetings, as he began to speak with his cousin. Atum's voice came over the comm. Grandmaster, have the Imperial artillery target the hive city now occupied by the Xenos. Urien hesitated. That might not be wise, he began, measured and cautious. After a moment's thought, he relented. All right, but let this be your triumph, the glory of the Nor worlds. Atum's gaunt face softened into an almost friendly smile. Don't worry about credit, he said. This won't be a full-scale assault. Now is the time to break them psychologically, to make them timid and uncertain. We can take our time. Cousin, Urien said, the clenched restraint in his voice giving way to something warmer. The Imperial army has been aching for revenge against the Xenos. They'll welcome this. So be it, Atum replied. Urien nodded, gratitude shining through his stern exterior. He spoke solemnly. Thank you for your generosity, for looking after the morale of the Empire. There's no need, Atum answered. Our goal is the same, to defeat the Randan Xenos. The Grandmaster fell silent after that, taking Atum's concession to heart and making a mental note to repay it someday. He appreciated his cousin's willingness to share honor and spoils in order to raise the spirits and fighting effectiveness of allied forces. The Imperial legions needed a show of force, a strike that would answer the Xenos' brazenness, vent pent-up fury, restore morale, and sweep away the dread and hesitation the Randan had sown. Artillery, listen up! The Grandmaster's lips curled into a predatory smile as he gave the order. Range your batteries on Hive City, fire at irregular intervals, keep them guessing, make the Xenos feel what it's like to be constantly on guard, sleepless. Order received, Grandmaster. The artillery commander acknowledged with a crisp salute, a hungry gleam in his eyes. The batteries swung into position and began to pepper the hive with sporadic barrages. Shells punched into the dense clusters of buildings, not enough to flatten the city, but enough to strike fear and force constant vigilance. Without the protection of the warp shield, the Randan were forced to scramble. Emergency power coughed to life, feeding their anti-aircraft batteries and lifting searchlights into the sky. Guns tracked and fired, plumes of smoke and tracer fire meeting the falling shells and diverting them from their worst hits. The pattern, irregular, savage, and persistent, left the Randan no room to breathe. Crews remained at their posts, sentries patrolled frantically, and commanders watched every sector with unblinking eyes. There was no chance to relax. Every tremor or distant blast might be the one that changed everything. Chapter 193, Demonic Weapons. Shortly after the Hive City's void shield collapsed, the Randan Xenofleet abruptly halted its assault and began to regroup just beyond the defensive perimeter. Doom rested on his command throne, scanning the fleet's consolidated feed. He knew a counterattack was coming. In fact, his whole deployment had been arranged to produce exactly this result. Beneath the orbital engagement, the Randan ground forces were in open panic, broadcasting desperate calls for reinforcements. Those distress signals would force the Void Fleet to mount a relief operation. Void Fleet engagements dragged on. Any meaningful relief would take hours for the Randan ships to withdraw, reorganize, and strike again. That delay played directly into Doom's hands. On the tactical sand table, the star system unfolded in holographic detail. Doom filled in gaps in the defenses, cross-checking his instincts with the ironclad calculations provided by the Iron Man. The reinforcements from the First Legion's fleet were a crucial boon. Every additional hull made the perimeter steadier. Even if the enemy had somehow learned the battleship's secrets, 3 Glory Queen-class battleships remained immovable behemoths. Doom allowed himself a small, satisfied tilt of his head. The plan was working exactly as intended. The Indomitable Truth, the Abomination Exemplar, and the Royal Majesty were anchored at key points along the defense line to maximize their coverage and overlap. The First Fleet's ships worked in close coordination with the Imperial vessels, alternating covering fire and support so they could fully exploit both their offensive weight and defensive advantages. With the line deployed like that, the Xeno fleet alone would struggle to break through the combined Nur and Imperial forces. When that was secured, Doom turned his attention to the distant sensor contacts, the Randan's 2 remaining battle moons. After the battle moon in Morse's orbit had been destroyed, the Xenos' colossal stations had drawn closer together, using overlapping fields of fire to cover one another. They kept well away from Morse World and from the Royal Majesty, lurking on the far side of the star. Those battle moons could not be allowed to withdraw intact. If they escaped, they would become a future threat. The Imperium still did not know the full extent of Randan territory, and once the fighting for Morse was over, it would take a long time to track down the Xenos. Letting them go would be irresponsible for the future. It was better to nip the crisis in the bud and reduce the number of unknowns. Doom thought for a moment, then spoke slowly. "Send me to the training ground." A flare of teleportation light answered his command, and he arrived at the secluded edge of the field, unnoticed. He walked toward the center, where Custodes and Destroyer warriors were sparring, and the Night Watch stood in silent observation. Two thin stone blades whispered against each other, as two of the universe's finest fighters traded controlled blows, practicing the technique known as restraint. "Shield Captain." Doom's voice was low, careful not to disturb the match. The Shield Captain flinched and instinctively reached to step back, but a pressure settled on his shoulder and pinned him in place. Only when his mind caught up did he realize the Primarch had slipped up behind him without a sound. Even though his attention had been fixed on the duel, being approached so quietly by the Primarch sent a cold sweat down his spine. He was about to open his mouth to greet him when the Primarch's look stopped him, an unmistakable summons to speak privately. "My lord, what are your orders?" the Shield Captain asked as they stepped into a secluded rest cabin at the edge of the training ground. "Is there a combat mission?" he added once they were inside. "Yes, Shield Captain Odysseus." Doom used the custodian's name, an echo of the Greek hero, before he gestured to a bench. "Sit." Odysseus set his halberd down, removed his helmet, and laid it on the table, then took the seat opposite the Primarch. He was a striking man, deep, classical features that carried the tired charm of an age-old hero. Doom tapped the table. A holographic projection sprang to life. "I need 600 Custodes," he said, "divided into 2 detachments. They will board the Xenos battle moons and destroy them from within." The holo shifted, showing the battle moons and their positions. From the moment the first fleet entered the system, its reconnaissance ships had slipped into the warp to gather everything they could on those battle moons. The display summarized what the fleet had found. The reconnaissance flotilla had done everything possible, skirting the battle moon for as long as their cloaks held. Even so, their stealthy scans had only penetrated roughly 1/10 of the station's bulk. The Randan battle moons were vast, multi-layered fortresses, too large and too deeply defended to be fully mapped without risking the scouts' exposure. Odysseus studied the sparse schematics flickering on the holoscreen and spoke up, measured but urgent. "My lord, forgive my bluntness. How do we take it down? Do we overload the reactor?" Doom watched him for a long moment before answering. "The station is too large. Its corridors and access ways are a labyrinth. If we try to force a path to the core and stray from the route, we'll lose our way and fall into an ambush." "That is of no concern. The Custodes fear no enemy," another voice interjected, calm but firm. Odysseus shook his head. "It's not the garrison I'm worried about. Time is limited. If the Xenos decide to flee, if they go to ground in the warp and pull the battle moon with them, we could be dragged along. The consequences would be catastrophic." He finished the sentence, took the drink a service automaton offered, and waited for the Primarch's verdict. Doom's lips curved in a small, confident smile. "You do not need to destroy the core," he said, shaking his head. He reactivated the hologram. A projected device rose to the height of a man. Odysseus's eyes widened, and his hand went instinctively to his halberd. "Lord Primarch, you are playing with fire," he warned, voice tight. The holographic image showed a transparent canister, its surface etched with the Primarch's insignia and arcane runes. Inside swirled a sickly phosphorescent light, warp energy trapped and coiling within the chamber. Worse, something lay sealed at its core, a corpulent, bloated greater demon of Nurgle. Its flesh bubbled with pustules, its belly split open and alive with writhing maggots. The thing's spirit seemed exhausted, a long, slow rot made visible. Odysseus's heart thudded. His black eyes reflected the Primarch's form, as a memory rose unbidden, the Emperor's charge to the Custodes. Primarch 21 can do anything, even make use of the knowledge of chaos. His power is equal to mine. Were it not for that command from the Emperor, Odysseus would have demanded to know where the Primarch had learned such things. The destroyer warriors will escort it, the Primarch said quietly. When it has burrowed 1/3 of the way into the battle moon, detonate it. Doom gave no further details. He only added, to calm the custodian, it won't try to flee. Self-detonation is its only chance. Nur had been developing psyker weapons for a long time, cautiously probing forbidden warp knowledge. In that work, he had the private backing of Lifeforger Primal, who supplied classified research and insight specifically on demons. With destroyer warriors posted as guards at the Daemon research facility, psyker masters combined that illicit lore with older traditions to produce a number of so-called daemon weapons. What Doom was showing now was one of them, a corrosive bomb. It had been fashioned by snaring a greater daemon of Nurgle from the warp, using the creature's putrescent properties and binding them with chronomancy and temporal technology. One of those time bombs, seeded with a corrosive plague, could reduce a world to the equivalent of 1,000,000 years of rot in the space of 3 minutes. Doom employed daemon weapons only when absolutely necessary. They were too dangerous to use lightly. No ship with enough firepower could get close to the battle moons, and any Xenos who had seen such an attack before would scatter the instant a threat appeared. The only vessels that could approach were too lightly armed to do any real damage. Using black hole weapons recklessly was out of the question. It would upset the system's gravitational balance and could trigger chain reactions that might annihilate the entire Morse star system. The boarding party could carry only the daemon weapons forged by Nur. Custodes, Doom said to Odysseus, a note of helplessness in his voice. This is a last resort. Out of respect, I'm telling you about these unclean weapons. Odysseus inclined his head. The Primarch could have kept the matter secret and simply ordered the Custodes to escort the destroyer warriors. By consulting them, he had shown them the highest respect. After a moment's thought, the shield captain spoke. I support your plan, he said, but when we return to Terra, I must report this to the Emperor. Understood, Doom replied with a nod. The Custodes' conduct was beyond reproach. They had every right to reserve judgment and to bring such matters before the Emperor. I'll go make the final preparations, Odysseus said. He drained his cold drink, shoved on his helmet, hefted his halberd, and assembled the Custodes for the operation. Doom rose and gave them brief orders. Report to the standard armory. There are pieces of equipment there you'll find useful. Understood, Odysseus replied, eyes brightening. The weapons and gear forged on Nur were renowned for their practicality. Doom watched the Custodes file out and let out a quiet, helpless sigh. If his legion had been at full strength, he would never have had to expose these secrets, even to the Custodes. Any secret the Custodes learned would inevitably reach the Emperor. They were, after all, the master of mankind's most loyal servants, sacrificing everything in his name. Take me to the Daemon weapon chamber, Doom said. A teleportation glow burst at his feet. The warding sigil that marked his presence in the rest cabin winked out, and he vanished. The Daemon weapon chamber lay in a hidden corner of the royal majesty, isolated from ordinary mortals and known to very few. The chamber itself occupied another dimension. The corridors that led to it were treacherous by design, a deterrent to anything that might try to escape back into the material world. The door was etched with the Old One's psyker runes, glyphs that shielded it from all psychic detection. Chapter 192, Boarding the Battle Moon. Thanks for all your donations. Outside the demon armory, 10 destroyer warriors stood in 2 neat rows, weapons at the ready as they guarded the entrance. When the transmission light flickered, they gripped their arms reflexively, then, recognizing the arrivals, dropped to one knee and intoned in unison, Genefather, rise. Doom waved them off. He had told them not to kneel, but the Primarch's children insisted on the gesture as a sign of respect. King Nawick. 10 psyker masters in long robes bowed as the newcomer approached. Doom offered a genuine nod. You've worked hard, he said, acknowledging their service. The psyker masters were covered in golden runes that pulsed faintly. Those sigils maintained psychic barriers to block any immaterial intrusion. "Open the gate," Doom ordered. "I need to retrieve some weapons." Two of the Psyker Masters stepped forward, palms etched in glowing runes. "As you command," they intoned, and began to weave their spells, channeling psychic energy into the armory's locking wards. A gap opened in the psychic shield, and the door cracked inward. Voices spilled out, overlapping, furious, absurd. "I give the Blood God 3-7 against the Dark Prince. He could cleave him 7 times in 3 minutes. No, no, no!" The Dark Prince would be crying and begging the Blood God for mercy. Then, did the Lord of Change set them at odds on purpose? What's the point of all this slaughter? Why not sit and hear the merciful Father's teachings? Love one another. Blasphemous bloodthirster, the Dark Prince will rip out your filthy tongues and slash your throats. This is the Godslayer's territory. If the Dark Prince tries that, we'll probably be dead by the Godslayer's hand before the Prince has the chance. There was a burst of raucous laughter that choked into a strangled sound. Inside the armory, it was a tangle of howls and taunts, but as the door opened, the noise died at once, cut off as if some invisible hand had closed their mouths. In the gap stood the Godslayer. He filled the doorway like a blade. His gaze was cold and hostile, fixed on them as if they were already corpses. 40 jars lined the hall, each sealed with runes and each holding 10 of the 4 gods' great demons. The jars were only human height, forced onto hulking bodies that should have dwarfed them. The titans inside had been compressed until they fit. At the sight of him, the Lord of Change folded its wings and shrank its head like a startled bird, suddenly as meek as a quail. The bloodthirster dropped to one knee, paying respect to Doom, the Godslayer, and dared not show the slightest presumption. The Keeper of Secrets trembled, its long black-purple tongue twisting against the roof of its mouth, terrified even to make a sound. The great unclean one sagged inward. The maggots scuttling over its sickly green flesh quivered as its color drained with panic. Doom's gaze was almost physical, scorching their skin and sending up a white, smoking heat. The demons flinched under the pain, but kept silent. None would meet the Godslayer's crushing presence. Doom's fists clenched as a savage urge to rend them rose in his chest. He forced it down. The mark of the Godslayer burned in the runes on the jar walls, feeling as if it came alive, branding their impure bodies with heat. 2 bloodthirsters, 2 great unclean ones. Doom's face was unreadable, his voice as cold as frost. "Take them and rendezvous with the custodes." He turned to leave before he could give in to the urge to slay a few demons just to vent his anger. As soon as the Godslayer moved away, the gathered fiends breathed out in relief. A surge of elation ran through them. If they had been anywhere else, they might have cheered. If they were slain by those jars and their forms dissolved, their concepts and power would be sent back to the warp, and they could be reborn, free at last from the Godslayer's shadow. They imagined a future where the skies were wide, the seas vast, and they would never have to see him. Ain, 4 destroyer warriors filed into the hall. The bloodthirsters and great unclean ones flashed hopeful looks, desperate to be chosen. A few of the larger demons even jabbed a claw toward themselves. "Behave!" one destroyer barked, and the giants snapped to attention. To the great demons, Doom was the lord who had just departed, and the destroyer warriors who remained were his lieutenants. To demons, the mortal world was a playground, a virtual arena of sensations they invaded for sport, delighting in crushing flesh and will. Their bravado came from knowing death was no obstacle. In the warp, they could be reborn indefinitely, so they prowled reality with reckless cruelty and no reverence. The Godslayer was different. He carried the concept of eradication, and his Primarch's children inherited it. The Destroyer Warriors were the living embodiment of that concept, true death. To die at their hands meant annihilation in the absolute sense. A demon cut down by a Destroyer Warrior did not merely lose its form. Its past and future, its true name and its mark in the warp were wiped clean. Even the demon's essence would be stripped away and turned into fuel for the Destroyer's power. No wonder demons feared them. Seeing Doom, the Godslayer's instruments of annihilation, was more terrifying than facing the 4 gods. When a demon was struck down by an ordinary rival deity, its form might be scattered, but its true name and warp mark survived. Killed by a destroyer warrior, it was erased from every ledger of existence. If the worshipped deity was pleased, a demon could be resurrected and return to bask in divine favor once more. A low growl from a destroyer warrior quieted the chamber. The lesser demons fell silent, standing like merchandise waiting to be chosen. Without ceremony, the destroyer warriors draped psychic black cloths over the jars at the front of the line, shielding them from prying eyes. The ones picked for selection erupted with joy, throwing haughty looks at the others, as if already restored to glory. The warriors caught the handles on the tops of the vessels, hoisted the sealed containers, and marched out of the demon armory. When the door fell shut, the great demons resumed their raucous talk, jeering at the gods. Outside the reach of divine sight, they spoke freely, openly deriding the four deities and airing grievances they would never voice before their patrons. Elsewhere, in the Royal Majesty's hangar, 600 custodes were arrayed in 2 cohorts, prepared for deployment. Metal wings had been fitted to their gilded armor, flight packs engineered to carry them through the most tangled, unforgiving terrain. The jump packs had originally been built for the destroyer warriors, but they'd been pressed into service by the custodes for this mission, both sides serving the Empire's aims. Because the custodes and the destroyer warriors were roughly the same height, the gear fit them almost interchangeably. Doom's eyes brightened at the sight. The custodes in their burnished gold armor, each with a pair of dark wings, looked like fallen angels descended to war. Trailing them were 20 destroyer warriors in black plate, their presence a stark contrast to the gilded custodes. They escorted the forbidden weapons, sealed containers that held demons, sliding in like something that should never see daylight. Doom turned to the shield captain and issued his command without ceremony. Captain Odysseus, can you achieve maximum results and wipe out the Xenos' gargantuan structures? Odysseus planted the haft of his halberd in one hand and raised his other, in salute, fist to chest. His voice was steady. The custodes will complete the mission. Doom nodded once, then motioned to the stone men standing by. Put this on. Technicians stepped forward, carrying small, ornate rings. Odysseus frowned, puzzled by the devices held in their hands. A stone man held up the circular bracelets for the shield captain to see. These are teleportation lassos, he explained. They'll pull you off the Xenos vessel and back to the transport if your lives are in danger, or when the mission is done. Doom let his gaze sweep slowly over the line of custodes on the tarmac before he spoke. The Emperor entrusted you to me, he said, voice calm and deliberate. I am responsible for your lives. Thank you for your concern. Odysseus's reply was sincere. He truly appreciated the Primarch's thoughtfulness. The new devices would not only augment the custodes' capabilities in the field, but also guarantee a means of extraction for every warrior. Privately, Odysseus found him thinking that this Primarch was steadier, more considerate than some of the others. Doom gave a single curt signal. The stone man began passing out the teleportation lassos, one to each custodes and destroyer warrior, ensuring everyone had at least that basic layer of protection. Have no fear, Primarch, Odysseus called, voice steady and unwavering. We will return victorious. He raised his halberd, turned, and started for the transport. Custodes, board the ship. Alongside him, the destroyer warriors readied their flight packs, machines sealing and priming the harnesses. Brothers, board the ship, they answered in unison. We will seize victory for the Gene Father. Doom said nothing. He clenched his fists as he watched his Primarch sons depart. Through their psychic link, he sent them only, may you return safely. This boarding action was 1,000 times more perilous than a routine boarding. The target was an iron world, a battle moon, crawling with savage Xenos. The teams would have to penetrate roughly a third of the moon's mass to reach the hidden daemon weapons and detonate them from within. Only 2 kinds of warriors could withstand the psychic rot leaking from the Xenos nest. The custodes, those perfect life forms the Emperor himself had made, and the destroyer warriors, the Primarch's own sons. Their task was brutal and unforgiving. Worse, the 2 strikes had to be executed in near-perfect sync. The destruction of the moons needed to be coordinated so that the detonations on both sides were no more than a minute apart. There would be no reliable communication once the fighting began. If one team fell behind, the other moon might slip into the warp and vanish. For that reason, the boarding party split into two groups and launched on two separate transport ships, each racing toward its grim objective. They launched in small reconnaissance skiffs, slipping out from the shadows of the battle fleet and riding the stealth fields of the warships toward the Xenos battle moon. The approach could take days. To minimize the risk of detection, the scouts would cut their drives at a prearranged distance and simply drift the rest of the way through the void. Author's note: by the end of the Third Xenos War, Horus has already been proclaimed war leader, so my ending will diverge a little from the original. In the canonical story, only 9 Primarchs attended Ulinor's coronation. In this Xenos War, I will explore a fate for a missing son using the clues the original work provides. Chapter 193, Void Fleet on Morse World. The Imperial forces' irregular bombardments kept the Randan on edge. The human artillery struck unpredictably and without mercy, never allowing the Xenos to settle. Still, the warriors clung to a single fragile hope, that their fleet would break the human blockade and sweep down to reclaim them, evacuating the survivors from the battlefield. It was that faint promise of rescue that stopped war leader Lolos from cutting his losses and forcing a decisive engagement with the human ground forces. Hesitation like that is a cardinal sin in war. If you lack the will to fight to the finish, you cannot orchestrate an orderly retreat. Day after day, the soldiers' morale bit by bit dissolved. The once razor-sharp army lost its edge and sank into a scatter of frightened, survival-driven creatures. Inside the Hive City, the constant human harassment pushed even the Randan elite to the brink. Their highly developed nervous systems and formerly ironclad mental fortitude began to fray. Fatigue crept into reflexes and thought alike. The Xenos' arrogance that had once been their hallmark cracked away, replaced by inner tremors and pleading murmurs. Whenever they dared to look up, they no longer saw the fleet as salvation. They only prayed that the sky would spare them one more day from falling human shells. In war, striking the heart is worth more than besieging the city. Atum had taken that lesson to heart, systematically eroding Randan fighting strength with relentless psychic torment to soften them up for the next phase. By the time the main army stormed the Hive City, they would not meet ferocious Randan warriors, but broken Xenos, easy prey. In the void, Doom personally took command. He coordinated the battle groups, sealing the front with blockades and meeting every Randan sortie with fierce resistance. Fleet actions lacked the up-close savagery of ground combat, but they were no less perilous, arguably more so. On a battlefield, a single flare of courage or a sudden surge at a critical point could flip the tide and lift morale. Nothing like that could happen between armored hulls in vacuum. Steel ships were cold and indifferent. The huge crews they carried could not be rallied by small, spontaneous variables. More practically, fleet commanders would not tolerate unpredictable elements among their ranks. Space warfare was a tightly calculated gamble. Every move measured, every risk accounted for. Weapon ranges and power, maximum ship speeds, shield overload thresholds, maneuver angles, every combat parameter had been reduced to constants. Within those fixed limits, the war was chaotic and merciless. Doom sat in his command throne like a precision instrument, constantly recalculating the variables of the defensive line and coordinating the fleet's movements. He watched vectors and energy readings flicker across the consoles, folding each new datum into his next command. Casualties mounted steadily. The cold, uncaring void punished every warship and every crew. Along the line Doom had drawn, human vessels and Randan ships traded fire. Lances and plasma arcs tore through the darkness. Engines cast an eerie, sputtering glow, and the sustained exchange of energy raised the local temperature and radiation. The stalemate had become a grinding war of attrition. Wrecked hulls littered the blockade, drawn together by gravity wells and twisted into tangled maelstroms. Yet the fighting never stopped. The accumulated debris of dead ships formed natural cover for the surviving vessels, creating shifting shields and ambush points amid the ruins. Reading the battlefield with ruthless clarity, Doom adjusted formations and baited maneuvers to steer the Randan into a trap. He had to hold his focus. There would be no mercy from momentum and mathematics. Destroy as many enemy ships as he could before the Randan boarding parties closed in. If the boarding operation succeeded, the Randan fleet would most likely withdraw, or, less likely, fight to the last ship. Either outcome favored Doom. A series of small, sustained tactical victories was steadily translating into the strategic win he sought. In the corner of a holographic star map, a sensor telescope trained on a patch of apparent emptiness. The stealth reconnaissance ships carrying the boarding party had burned for a single acceleration burst, then cut their main drives. Now they drifted on inertia toward the target. A cold, digital countdown on the display ticked off the hours until arrival. Doom watched the 72-hour ETA and let his eyes stray from the larger void battle as he weighed his next move. He had two choices. When the boarding team arrived, he could push a fleet forward to draw off more Randan ships and provide cover for the operation. But that gamble carried risk. After a long war of attrition, an abrupt, anomalous maneuver might only put the Randan on higher alert and undo the advantage the stealth approach had bought them. Staying put was safer. It kept the number of variables low, but doing nothing would put the boarding party at even greater risk. The moment the operation went live, the Randan would begin a systematic grid search for stray warships. The rendezvous ships were practically defenseless. If the Randan found them, they would be annihilated, and the boarding party would have no way back. 10 ships form a fist formation and advance, outflanking from the side of the defensive line to strike the enemy flank, someone suggested. Doom thought for 5 seconds and then made his choice: a frontal assault. The goal was to force the Randan fleet away from the battle moon, to draw their attention and fire. The cost would be terrible. 600 custodians, 20 destroyer warriors. Losses of that scale were unthinkable. Even the Emperor would not tolerate such a toll. "Notify Adam. The Void Fleet is launching an attack," Doom ordered. "The Randan on the ground will react. He must be ready for their counterstrike." Commands flowed from him without pause. He had to choreograph the space battle, anticipate the ground fight, and keep the distant boarding action viable all at once. These battlefields, though scattered across the void, were not isolated. Every move on one front sent ripples through the rest. The moment the Primarch's order came down, the Void Fleet snapped to. The abomination exemplar Gloriana Queen peeled off from the defensive line, leading 10 nerve vessels in a wide flanking sweep. "Execute the Primarch's orders. Maximum speed. Outflank and sweep the Xenos fleet," the Lord of the Void Sky Army roared, driving the ship's serfs to their stations. The same commander, lauded as the Lord of the Heavenly Host, showed no hesitation. The will of a Primarch was not for mortals to question. Nearly 10 days of grinding attrition had already taught him something fundamental. Watching the Primarch command opened his eyes to the gulf between a Primarch and an Astartes. They might share blood, but they were effectively different species. Apart from an awkward first day of fleet contact, when a hesitancy in the Primarch's unfamiliar intellect had cost several cruisers and frigates, his orders since then had been concise and razor-sharp. He called not just for maneuvers, but for exact ship locations and precise rotation times, and the fleet moved as if by a single, inexorable mind. Over the course of a week under the Primarch's command, Imperial ship losses steadily fell while victories mounted. The fleets adopted a mixed formation that played to the Nur's strengths. Imperial hulls absorbed the initial barrage, letting the Nur concentrate on long-range punishment. When the enemy's void shields were nearly drained, the Nur would turn to take the hits while the Imperials closed, allowing the Imperial batteries to open up at point-blank range. The tactic was simple and ruthless. Strike hard and fast, then disengage, swap positions, and let the Nur's guns rain down as they pulled back. As the crews learned the timing, the maneuver became almost mechanical. By the later engagements, casualties were negligible and victories routine. Very little cost, the joint force obliterated nearly 100 Randan capital ships and annihilated countless escorts and support craft. Lead with this ship. Adopt a spearhead formation. The Lord of the Heavenly Host barked orders, reshaping the compact fist into a deadly wedge. Deep in the belly of the Gloriana Queen, Adeptus Mechanicus servitors knelt at the plasma reactor and intoned prayers to the Omnissiah, coaxing the warship back to life. With systems roaring, the abomination exemplar drove forward at full burn, swinging in to strike the Randan line on the flank. Don't slow. Activate the bow disintegration field and punch through. Bring a broadside to bear. The Lord of the Heavenly Host thundered, his voice riding the ship's engines like a war cry. Panic flared on the Randan bridge. The captain's telepathic commands snapped out like jagged pulses. Evade! Evade! He ordered the thralls to reorient the hull desperately. The human assault had been too abrupt. Where there had been a slow, attritional blockade, now came a sudden flank attack. Confusion spread among the Randan. They had been watching the abomination exemplar closely. Hadn't it withdrawn from the line only moments ago and then rejoined it? How had that same warship suddenly materialized on their flank? They had no way of knowing that when the abomination exemplar fell back, it hadn't retired to safety at all, but slipped away from the blockade and swung into a concealed flanking run. At the forward line, a cruiser sat like a corpse, a crude decoy wearing the exemplar's face. It was bristling with holographic projectors, and its transponder had been amplified to broadcast the abomination's signature. Up close, the ruse was sloppy. In the midst of a firefight, under crushing radiation interference and broken sensor feeds, it was convincing enough. The stratagem was Iron Man Gates' doing. The idea, oddly, had been borrowed from the Randan themselves. Their mastery of electromagnetic jamming suggested a way to turn their own tricks back on them. Early in the war, even Doom had almost been fooled by similar false signals, mistaking hostile ghosts for allied ships. Gates ran the math, refused to accept the apparent readings, and argued, point by point, that there could be no friendly forces lurking in that sector of the void. When the Randan realized they had been outplayed, panic spread through their line. In that instant, the true abomination exemplar came screaming back. Her prow was sheathed in disintegrating lightning, engines burning at maximum. She drove straight into the tangle of battle and slammed into a Randan battleship with bone-crunching force. Biological matter exploded outward. The warship's tissues vaporized in a shower of disintegrating lightning, a crisp snap as its spine gave way, the sound mixed with the hiss of scattering ichor. Semi-biological vessels had obvious weaknesses. Without heavy armor, they could not survive a direct impact. Target lock complete, the cogitator array announced in its mechanical tone, signaling the captain that the firing window was ideal. Broadside cannons are an optimal arc. All ships, fire! The Lord of the Void Sky Army's order was ruthless and absolute. He let the abomination exemplar unleash its full salvo. Chapter 196, Soul Tempered by War. The Glory Queen class, the Empire's mightiest warship, made the whole sector tremble. Who could stand against her? No Xenos vessel could hope to endure her fury. The abomination exemplar held its course and speed, unleashing a full broadside across the limit of its firing arc. 8 Randan warships filled that arc, and every battery found a target. Lances flared like miniature suns, torpedoes streaked away, and the macro cannons thundered without pause. The exemplar's hull, more than 20 kilometers from prow to stern, was a wall of steel and light. Not a single weapon fell silent. The Randan shields blew out almost instantly. As the exemplar slid past the crippled line and streaked onward, the Randan fleet had no time to savor its narrow survival. The hit-and-run strike was only the opening move. Annihilation was already looming. Before the alien shields could fully regenerate, the Empire's silver-white ships surged in, the true finishing blow. Those oddly built Xenos ships were ill-suited to withstand a coordinated onslaught. Under the combined pounding of Imperial lances and macro cannons, their structures began to tear themselves apart. Explosions raced from hull to hull as the Randan formations unraveled, their own design proving no match for the merciless tempo of war. The 8 shield-stripped warships lay like ruptured carcasses in the void, torn open by the onslaught and drifting apart as new, lethal space hulks. An alarm sounded through the flagship, sharp, insistent. Lord of the Heavenly Host, deck alarm triggered. We have been boarded. The cogitator array answered in its own terrible chorus. Its polished housing held a forest of implanted interfaces, dozens of bionic visages and neural ports that danced with light as the machine brain processed incoming data. Hundreds of faces flickered across its surface, 100,000 threads of thought mapping the ship's condition in the same instant. Deck 6 has been invaded, the cogitator reported. The cogitator was no mere computer. After the Imperium outlawed true artificial intelligence, the Adeptus Mechanicus had grafted human brain tissue into the processing cores, blending steel and synapse until the thing thought like a machine with a human mind. It made it efficient and unnerving. The Lord of the Heavenly Host received the report and issued his command without hesitation. Surround the Randon from multiple directions. Clear all thralls in the area. Prevent the spread of xenopsychic contamination. Understood, came the cogitator's vocalizer, voice flat and metallic. Deploying Space Marines. The Lord of the Heavenly Host inclined his head once, acknowledging the response, but he did not let the boarding incident hold his attention. The abomination exemplar was still advancing, its vector broad and terrible across the fleet. He needed to shape the battle, raise a storm that would drive the enemy deeper where his prepared forces could seize them. The boarding could be contained, the larger trap had to be set. Urien had no idea what the Primarch was planning, but whatever it would shape the course of the war. Down on the ground, the Randan forces were already moving. Human slaves poured out of the ruined hive city after a long, grinding siege. Most of them were listless and pale, physically exhausted. The hive city had lost its primary power source and couldn't generate the resources needed to sustain the enormous human auxiliary army. The Randan, who regarded the humans as little better than pigs and dogs, weren't about to divert precious supplies to keep them alive. Autumn's voice cut through the comms from the command bunker. Grand Master, hold your positions. It's not time for a full assault yet. Understood, Commander Adam. Urien answered, a smile touching his determined face. After days of skirmishing with the Xenos and with the Nur Legion covering his flank, he'd finally been able to rest and felt ruddy and renewed. The smile faded when Autumn's tone hardened. We will hold the defensive bases. Do not sally forth rashly. Urien accepted the order without argument. He knew full well who Autumn represented, and when the larger game was at stake, he would follow the command. The true overlord of the campaign was the Primarch in orbit. He alone directed the broad strokes of the battle. Quietly, he was prepared to cooperate with Autumn, grateful for the Nur Legion's generous support. During the days of ground defense, Nur had sent ample supplies and rewards to both the Imperial Army and the Legion soldiers. Commence bombardment. After closing the channel, Urien ordered the artillery to open up on the human thralls. Extend the barrage. Carpet bomb the sector. First combat sequence. Move to battle positions. Second combat sequence. Prepare to relieve and hold against the human tide's assault. The Grand Master was no longer stingy. The two forward defensive bases were dismantled, and all troops were pulled back to the main strongpoint, giving him control of a much larger force. As the bombardment began, the rested Imperial Army surged back into the fight. The Nur line ran long, arcing slightly and enclosing roughly 1/5 of the Hive City's outer perimeter. It consisted of 250,000 mortal auxiliary army soldiers, 2.5 million automated combat servitors, and a variety of heavy fire support formations. Everyone stood tense, ready to meet the Randan assault, the oncoming tide of a massive human thrall army. Commander, do we use artillery? The Titans? The Mortal Legion commander asked from beside the command console. Autumn did not look up. His eyes stayed fixed on the human masses on the battlefield. Not yet, he said. Our troops need training. They must learn to face any kind of enemy. The commander hesitated. And the fallen? At the cost of blood, their comrades will be the crucible that forges their will, Autumn replied quietly. Let their resolve be tempered in battle so they can grow into true warriors. I understand. The Mortal Legion commander said no more and returned to his station. He sank back into his chair. A blue holographic projection hovered before him, letting him issue orders to his legion at a moment's notice. Autumn's central command overlooked the entire planet. Orbiting warships scanned Morse world without pause. From every hive city the populace had poured out, converging here until the holographic map was streaked a living red. He had not called for orbital bombardment. He intended to use this crushing pressure to broaden the horizons of the Nur mortal auxiliary army. In the limitless ocean of stars, battlefields like this were ordinary, and victory often meant shooting at your own kind as much as at Xenos. Autumn stood apart from the chaos, his gaze cold and unreadable as it swept over the blood-red host arrayed before them. He gave the order with the same clinical calm he wore like armor. No servitors. Form defensive lines. Engage the enemy with human arms only. His command wasn't barked down the ranks in person. In the Nur Legion, rank was a law. The overall commander devised strategy. Legion commanders executed it. Battalion and company leaders handled tactics and the immediate responses at the front. Autumn's voice was transmitted directly to the command terminals of each Legion commander, and the message propagated down the chain. At the forward defensive positions, junior officers repeated the order in measured tones, layer by layer, until it reached every squad. The terminals flickered, helmets chimed their acknowledgments. Disable auxiliary targeting. Cut visual feeds. Shut down servitor links. There was a short metallic clatter as soldiers moved in practiced unison, switching off automatic aimers and paging out non-essential HUD functions. Where fingertips brushed activators, tiny sparks ghosted into the dim. The act was ritual as much as obedience, a deliberate self-limitation, a pledge to fight without machine intervention. "Soldiers," an officer called, voice rising to carry across the trench lines. The command hung in the air like a drumbeat, steady, inevitable. We go in without auxiliaries, full-scale, brutal battlefield simulation. Hold the line against the enemy's assault. A battalion commander, leading 1,000 men, walked the defensive works. His voice, rough and unadorned like any soldiery voice, carried across the battalion comms. "We're years behind our brother units." He spat the words out as if to steal them. "Hold the line. Remember what they taught us at War College." The ground began to tremble. Human slaves surged forward in a living tidal wave, pressing against both the Imperial and Nur lines with horrifying momentum. The sight stole the breath of every man on the parapet. "For King Nawick," the battalion commander bellowed, his raw shout sent directly, unfiltered by the comms net, ringing along the fortifications. The cry picked up and spread until the whole line roared, "For King Nawick!" Deep voices rolled across the overcast sky like thunder. From the Imperial trenches, the answer came in kind, "For the master of mankind." Even knowing the enemy vastly outnumbered them, the defenders did not flinch. Their roar was fearless, born of training, faith, and the conviction that they would prevail. The Primarch watched from orbit, and the Emperor's gaze guarded Terra itself. "I've never seen so many people," a night watch soldier in the Nur line remarked casually to the man at his elbow, though the tremor in his hands betrayed the enormity of what they faced. His armor wasn't white like the others. It was the original gray of raw steel, the sigil of doom embossed on the shoulder plate. This man was one of the old Night Watch. He had lived through the Orc siege, fought in the War of Truth, and seen Doom Novik rise to power. To mark their honor, Doom had restored the original color to those veterans, setting them apart from the later recruits who wore the bright white of the current watch. "Aren't you nervous?" the new recruit asked, voice tight as he tightened his grip on his spear. His fingers trembled from the strain of standing the line. "Nervous? What's that?" the veteran said with a half scoff, and then, more gently, laid a calloused hand on the young man's shoulder. "I've stood on battlefields 1,000 times more terrifying than this." The recruit hesitated. He had heard rumors that parts of Nur's history had been expunged, whole horrors unrecorded, and curiosity pushed at him. "What was it?" he asked. The older man closed his eyes for a long beat, then shook his head. "I hope you never see it in your life." His voice went low and steady, heavy with something the recruit couldn't yet understand. That was the deepest kind of terror. Only courage and will can stand against it. He said no more. Raising his spear, the veteran resumed his patrol down the line, the young recruit falling into step beside him as they kept silent watch over the mortal auxiliary army. The Legion commanders had cut power to several auxiliary systems and abandoned any attempt at ultra-long-range fire. Their new order was simple and deliberate. Let the enemy close to within 500 meters before engaging. They trusted the Legion's weapons to hold back the surging human tide once the lines met. The Imperial line was already in action. Red laser beams stitched together into a deadly lattice, forming a blockade that met the advancing human brethren head-on. These troops had seen the worst, and so handled the crisis with practiced calm. No panic, only efficient killing. Along the Nur line, stray rounds hissed through the air as the slave army's automatic weapons stuttered and barked. Bullets pinged off power armor. Loose shots spattered the ground like rain. Every ricochet and near miss tested the new recruits' nerves, striking at the thin veneer of confidence hammered into them by their abbreviated guard training. The Night Watch watched all of this with quiet amusement. Under their helmets, they smiled as they observed how the mortals, those given only simplified guard instruction, kept their fear from turning into hysteria. They were interested, clinical in the air attention, gauging who would hold and who would crack. Then, in the middle of that taut silence, a veteran of the guard suddenly roared, "Hey!" Chapter 197, Strictly Guard Against. The mortal soldiers trembled. The old veteran's shout had snapped their nerves taut. Fingers hovered over triggers as if by instinct, ready to fire. It was only at the last moment, when decades of training finally took over, that they held their fire. The company commander stared at the Night Watch, cold sweat running down his face. He was shaken too. If his men had opened fire, the fallout would have been severe. At best, he might be sent for retraining. He was painfully aware of what a single misstep could cost him. Fortunately, his troops had passed the Night Watch Lord's test. "Not bad," the Night Watch said, nodding once. The mortals before him had not disgraced their warrior training. "Lord," the commander began, voice careful, the heat from his exertion being wicked away by his power armor's internal circulation. The Night Watch raised a hand to cut him off. "What are you nervous about?" he asked. The old veteran barked, "What has you so nervous?" "Nervousness clouds your judgment," he continued. "It makes you forget your training. Tension only stiffens the body. Relax. True strength comes from within. The foes ahead are nothing but a breeze." His words loosened the soldier's shoulders. After a few deep breaths, fingers eased away from triggers. "We are an unyielding wall. Stay calm. A breeze passes in an instant, but the wall endures. More important than worrying about the enemy is worrying about your weapon. Make sure it will fire when it has to." With the tip of his spear, the Night Watch tapped a nearby recruit on the shoulder and asked softly, "Can your weapon fire?" The soldier's hand trembled. He glanced down and discovered the safety was still on. The Night Watch shook his head and chuckled. "Fresh recruits. I don't know what they think they're so afraid of," then walked off. Even with identical warrior training, individuals varied. Mortal soldiers could never fully grasp that difference. He shook his head, but the Night Watch couldn't help admiring the mortal soldiers. It was their first real battle, and yet their posture never wavered. Training had smoothed over whatever fragility they felt inside. A company commander strode up to a young soldier. "You," he barked. "If you survive this, you'll write out a self-criticism." "Understood," the soldier shouted, forcing his voice so everyone could hear. He knew how serious his mistake had been. He slid back into his firing position, brought the weapon to his shoulder, aimed at the oncoming line, and waited for the order. Commands crackled from the command center through the Legion commanders to the front. When the frontline officer gave the single cool order, no roar of bravado, only an authority that brooked no question, the men pressed their triggers and opened fire. Electromagnetic rounds hissed from their barrels, clean and precise. The alien conscripts were thin and wizened, but fanaticism still twisted their faces as they charged. There was no thunderous volley, only the sharp, clinical sound of accelerated projectiles and the steady cadence of men doing what they had been trained to do. As the Nur Auxiliary Army opened fire, enemy ranks collapsed in swaths. With each volley that found its mark, the men realized how fragile that supposedly overwhelming tide really was. On the battlefield, they learned the only thing you could rely on was the weapon in your hand. Fear and hesitation only ever weighed you down. The first shots were chaotic, but within 30 seconds, the fire became steady and rhythmic. An army's quality shows itself in its shooting, and the Auxiliary Army made that clear. Trained since childhood and tempered by bloodshed, the soldiers' minds steadied under pressure. The panic eased, professionalism took over, and their training began to carry the day. Their electromagnetic nail guns hurled steel bolts at 2,000 meters per second, shredding through bodies and armor alike. Instead of holding the triggers and spraying indiscriminately, They switched to aimed fire, relying on the weapon's sights once the auxiliary aiming systems failed. The electromagnetic nail guns whirred, their muzzles sparking as they spat 8mm steel nails in an endless hail, punching fist-sized holes through flesh and bone. Cheap to produce, these coil guns were ideal for the auxiliary army. They combined heavy-hitting power with sustained output. A standard magazine held 500 finger-length nails, which simplified logistics, and each weapon drew from the power armor's pack. The compact nuclear cells meant a squad could fight for decades without resupply. Reload. The auxiliary units operated in small, tightly coordinated teams, rotating their magazines and shifts to keep a continuous wall of fire. In front of the Nur line lay a piled mountain of corpses and scattered severed limbs, the ruined remains of the attackers. The Empire's laser rifles cauterized biological wounds on impact, so the dead accumulated in great piles without rivers of flowing blood. In the command center, Autumn nodded almost imperceptibly. The Gene Father's work had not been in vain. The data showed that when the auxiliary army opened fire, ammunition use spiked, but the number of kills per round was very low. After a minute of adjustment, the ratio climbed and kept improving. He stared at his command console, paying little attention to individual enemy movements and concentrating instead on coordinating the mortal forces. Notify the artillery. Bombard this sector with phosphorus rounds. The Legion commander traced a zone on the overall map. Burn their corpses so the infantry's fields of fire won't be obstructed. Supply teams keep pace. Continuously monitor ammunition expenditure so the warriors never worry about running dry. Rotation in 1 minute. Every man must take a life and earn his baptism of the battlefield. Each of the 25 Legion commanders carried out their orders, steering the operation across the field. They were changing, shedding panic and weaknesses, growing more competent by the minute. Autumn, too, stopped getting hung up on trivial matters. By the time the Nur auxiliary army had grown competent, Autumn turned his attention to the overall situation. Orbital scans showed that Morse World still held 600 million people, virtually all of them under Randon control. The planet had originally harbored roughly 1 billion. The First Legion had already wiped out some 400 million. What remained was still shrinking fast. Non-combat attrition, the deaths caused by exposure, disease, and the aliens' methods of subversion, was now outpacing the casualties the human forces were inflicting. To sap the invading troops' strength, the Randon had driven the population out of the hive cities and spread them across the planet, forcing them to march on foot through the wilderness and effectively surround the landing forces. Adam shook his head at the scale of it. He had known the Randon's contamination abilities were dangerous. He had not realized how thoroughly they could be applied. Grandmaster Urian's intelligence made the method clear. The key to Randon control was the water. The aliens would first infect a handful of individuals, then introduce their secreted brain fluid into a hive city's water supply. From that tiny seed, a psychic link would spread. Only minute quantities were required for the Randon to reach into human minds, twist thought, and bind whole populations into obedient servants. The process was irreversible. Once someone was taken, it was eternal damnation. With the shifting tide of the Void battle, the entire population of Morse World was mobilizing to encircle them. The alien war leader in Hive City could no longer contain his fury. He had thrown caution aside and was preparing a coordinated strike against humanity, timing his assault with the movements of the Void fleet. Autumn rested his chin in his hand, studying the map and weighing how the aliens might strike the human lines. A frontal ground attack or an air assault seemed unlikely. Without energy shields, elite warriors exposed, concentrated firepower would be nothing more than walking corpses. He needed to know where the enemy would hit next. Master of Mechanics. His voice was cold. A bright light flashed in his eyes as he summoned the Nur technical officer. A middle-aged man in a black robe with an auxiliary arm pack on his back stepped out from the command fortress. Lord, he said, bowing slightly. What are your orders? Adam nodded. Is the seismic monitor functioning normally? A mechanical arm extended from the technician's pack and projected a holographic feed. It's working, the Master of Mechanics replied, but with all the artillery on the field, the signal's full of noise. Autumn's face tightened. On the display, the seismic trace jittered and spiked like the readout from an overexcited heart monitor. Not calm, not reliable. Whatever the enemy planned next, it was coming through the static, but pinning down the exact location would be difficult. Doom looked at the Master of Mechanics and said with absolute certainty, "The aliens will attack from underground." "I understand." The Master of Mechanics retracted his mechanical arm, bowed, and went to deploy instruments to guard against subterranean incursions. Autumn nodded. It was not too late to take precautions. This battle had not yet reached its climax. At the moment, the Primarch was grinding down the Randan Void fleet, pushing for maximum effect. The Gene Father's objective was clear. Destroy the Randan fleet before their boarding parties could act. The Randan troops on the surface were disposable, meat on humanity's chopping block, meant to be exterminated or driven off at humanity's discretion. If the Randan were forced to abandon Morse's Reeses, orbital strikes and wipeout orders would have been enough to purge the alien infection. But the Randan could not be allowed to withdraw. The Primarch needed elite warriors in play to bait and pin the enemy fleet. The battlefield had become a tense tug-of-war. Any rash move by either side could produce total defeat and ruin the chance to secure the greatest possible gains. Time ticked on, and Doom's chessboard was slowly shifting toward the outcome he had predicted. In the black between stars, 2 scout warships, after a long run of skipping stones, finally rounded to the far side of the sun, slipping into position between the twin battle moons. "Kebril," Odysseus said to the destroyer warrior at his side, "we're almost at our objective." The scout ship's hangar thrummed with readiness. The Imperium's finest had gathered, 300 custodians and 10 destroyer warriors, an army that, on paper, could subdue a world without breaking a sweat. All of them were focused on a single goal: board the alien battle moon. 3 more hours, Kebril answered with a nod, correcting Odysseus's estimate with a soldier's calm. 2 hours, 57 minutes, a nearby custodian interjected, not to be outdone, offering the exact countdown. They exchanged amused smiles, utterly unfazed. The battle moon and its rock gold defenders were treated with the same casual contempt one might reserve for a flock of sheep or a line of ants, an inevitable, trivial obstacle. There was no tension in the hangar, just the quiet confidence of warriors certain of their victory. Beep. A tone sounded inside Kibril's armor, folded into his helmet systems, an understated, clinical alert that cut through the camaraderie like a blade. The captain's face shifted, an urgent transmission coming in. "Sir," he snapped, words tumbling out as he relayed the change. "A new alien fleet has entered the Morse system." Odysseus and Kebril exchanged a quick look. The news altered everything. In the hangar, a holographic projection bloomed, showing what the sensors had just seen. Alien ships pouring out of the warp into real space, reinforcing the fleet they had already driven back. The situation had taken a sharp, dangerous turn. The Primarch's carefully laid plan had just hit an unforeseen complication. Should they press on? The question went through the psychic link. A brother on one of the scout ships queried Kebril, "What do we do?" "Hold," Kebril answered into the link. As a senior officer of the Legion, he was expected to respond, but he hesitated. This concerned the Primarch of the 21st Legion, and the Primarch's sons outranked both him and Odysseus. Both men waited. A faint, distant voice finally threaded through the link. "Wait." The single command carried enough authority to halt everything. All operations frozen, the scout ships ordered to remain on standby in the void. Through the psychic link, the destroyer warriors recognized the voice immediately. "We obey your command." Kebril turned to Odysseus. "Wait," he said quietly. "The Gene Father's objective is to annihilate the alien fleet. We cannot interfere with his strategic goal." "We will wait then," Odysseus replied. "We remain in reserve until the Gene Father destroys the alien fleet, and only then will we act when an opportunity opens." Kebril phrased his words carefully, wrapping the psychic transmission in calm logic and inference so that it sounded like sober counsel rather than direct contact. Odysseus inclined his head. The Primarch's objective was exactly as Kebril had described. A new concern crossed Odysseus's face. Can the Primarch's fleet handle the reinforcements that just arrived? Kebril studied the holographic display in silence. The alien order of battle in Morse had swollen to 300 capital ships, not counting countless smaller escorts. He felt no panic. No matter the odds, he trusted the Gene Father's plan. He must have a plan, Kebriel said, steady and untroubled. His confidence was absolute. Odysseus nodded and returned to the custodian ranks. Continue to hold position, he ordered his comrades. The custodians made no objection. They had obeyed the Emperor's command and taken the Primarch to war, naturally deferring to the destroyer warrior's judgment. The atmosphere aboard Nur's ship was almost absurdly comfortable. Kebriel drifted to one side. There was nothing to explain. His brothers already knew. Aliens, he said under his breath, sour amusement in his voice. Daring to delay my return to the embrace of the benevolent Father, I'll see they're well handled. A low, angry curse came from a black-shrouded jar. The rat-ghoul inside had earned the enmity of a great unclean one of Nurgle. Meta. El rang as Kebriel gave the jar a hard kick. Clang, clang, then turned his face away. Don't misunderstand, the demon's voice rattled out, suddenly submissive. I'm set on those damned aliens. I have no wish to strike at Nur. The great unclean one was not foolish enough to pick a fight with Nur, but it had no qualms about wreaking vengeance on any other life form that crossed it. Kebriel's reply was a short, warning nod. It had better stay that way. He moved on toward the bridge to get a clearer picture. Across the void, alien ships kept appearing, tearing out of the warp, lingering briefly to regroup, then surging forward straight for the front line. Doom sat at the command console, eyes fixed on the dense array of warships that filled the star chart. A slow smile spread across his face. Excellent, he murmured, slapping his hand against the armrest of his throne and applauding once in satisfaction. The rat-ghoul reinforcements had arrived at exactly the right moment, vindicating his plan to lure the enemy deep into the system. Days earlier, a psyker had warned him that vessels were coalescing in the warp. Now, seeing the fleet's true scale with his own eyes, Doom exhaled a long, relieved breath. Without those reinforcements, it would have been difficult to deliver the honors and spoils he had promised. He closed his eyes and let his consciousness reach out into the warp, searching. He felt a familiar presence brush against his mind, and a pleased expression crossed his features. His good brother had joined the battle just in time. In the Morse star system, the holographic star map bloomed with ships as far as the sensors could see. Across the public channel, the rat-ghoul voices rose, eerily alien and full of swagger. Humans, our fleet will crush you, they cried, their cocky certainty echoing through the comms as their ranks erupted in savage cheers. The Morse system bristled with warships. Over 500 capital hulls drifted between the planets, backed by countless destroyers and frigates. With that kind of weight, strategy was almost irrelevant. Simple numbers were a tactic of their own. To overwhelm the enemy by sheer volume, to pour ship after ship into the field until humanity could no longer hold. This fleet had seized the initiative simply by existing. Then the light of the warp flared, and new shapes bled back into real space. At the head of the new arrivals rode a warship painted in the cool hues of the northern wind, a massive wolf's head totem carved into its prow. The Raffenkel emerged and took its place among the Imperium's storm. Doom, my good brother. Russ's voice came over the comms, wild and triumphant, and the crackle of it lifted the spirits of every voice on the net. With two of the Emperor's sons now standing in Morse, how could the Xenos hope to resist? A hologram blinked to life at Russ's side. Russ, it's been a long time, Doom said, his smile genuine and oddly gentle. Years had changed him. Where once he had been unseen, now he stood incarnate in master-crafted power armor, its plates etched with Fenrisian runes, an echo of home, and a statement that, however time had altered them, the brothers had come together again. He wielded a power sword with a wolf's head for a hilt. The blade was etched with ice-blue runes and capped in jagged blue fangs. Russ's golden hair was tied back in a messy ponytail, braids framing his temples. His face was the same, but his bearing was wilder than before. You truly didn't lie to me. A massive war awaits, Russ said, joy written across his features. Raffenkel's augurs had picked up the rat-ghoul fleet. How could I ever lie to a brother? Doom replied, answering with confident pride. Guilt had fled him. Before the rat-ghoul reinforcements had been confirmed, a small unease had nagged at him. Now he felt fearless. The moment the First Legion's Void forces sent word of the threat, Doom had sent for aid from the nearest legion. He had not expected Russ to be the closest. At first, the Lord of Wolves, the Great Wolf, had been reluctant to involve himself. In his view, Doom's own power was more than sufficient. He could handle most problems alone. Even against the dangerous Rak Ghoul, Russ had thought his presence would amount to little more than an audience. Doom had not waited. He dispatched an urgent message via Astropath. The First Legion was under siege. Vast numbers of Xenos had entrenched themselves on Morse. Russ only agreed to come after a pause. He added one condition. If his brother had lied, then the Space Wolves were to be properly rewarded, and the two brothers would drink themselves senseless afterwards, with Nur supplying the fine wine. Doom agreed at once. Securing Russ's presence mattered most. To keep Russ's approach hidden, Doom ordered the Judgment Sword to make a warp run that would scrub the fleet's imprint from the immaterium. "We'll rendezvous later. I need to clear an operating area first," he said. Russ's face hardened when he saw the size of the alien fleet. He understood immediately that this would not be an easy fight. As it should be. Doom opened the star chart and pointed to a strategic node, then overlaid the latest intelligence on the Rak Ghoul. Russ scanned it, his expression flickering as the information registered. His lips twitched, bearing two long canine teeth. "Damn Xenos," he growled. "They even managed to get hold of Imperium intelligence. They came prepared." He ground his teeth in fury. More hateful than the enemy, he thought, were the traitors who fed the enemy from within. Russ's face hardened. "This isn't the First Legion acting recklessly," he said. "It's a trap set to catch our brothers." As a Primarch, he saw it instantly. The Rak Ghoul hadn't been aiming at the Legion at all. Their goal was to isolate, besiege, even slay a Primarch. The first had simply wandered into a prepared gauntlet. The discovery confused friend and foe alike. Neither the Imperium nor the Rak Ghoul had expected this turn. "I'll deal with the alien ships first," Russ declared. He nodded, eyes narrowing. He had already read the enemy's intent and knew how to counter it. "Space Wolves!" The Great Wolf's savage cry swept through the fleet and lifted the human force's spirits. "Rend the Rak Ghoul whelp's defenses. Make them rue the day they challenge the Imperium of Man." On his command, the Space Wolves' armada surged forward like a hunting pack unleashed. Another Primarch had arrived in the fray, and with their presence, the battle between the Rak Ghoul and the Imperium only intensified. Chapter 197, Space Wolves. The Morse system looked ordinary at first glance. One small star, a handful of worlds, but its importance belied that simplicity. More than 500 Randan capital ships had gathered here, and two Primarchs of the Imperium stood poised to contest them. Doom let the joy of reunion fade. There was no time for celebration. He focused instead on the holostar before him, tracing maneuvers and stitching together a counterattack. A cold smile touched his lips as he watched the dispositions on Morse World. The Randan force was valuable. Its losses proved that Randan could not afford to lose tens of thousands of elite warriors. Strategy, not sentiment, would decide this. "Autumn, keep pressing the enemy ground forces," Doom ordered simply. The destroyer warrior understood without elaboration. "By your command," Autumn replied, solemn and steady, accepting the trust of his gene-father. Doom inclined his head once, but offered no further words. He turned his attention to the fleets gathered beyond Morse's orbit. Nur's first fleet, the First Legion fleet, and a newly arrived reinforcement armada together mustered over 400 capital warships. Among them, Russ's contribution was enormous, 200 capital ships alone, an imposing concentration of force that would shape the coming clash. On the holographic display, the Space Wolves fleet fanned out like a hunting pack, springing on the Randan line. "Wolves, rend the Xenos with the Fang formation," Russ bellowed from the Hrothgar, driving the fleet with raw excitement. "Show your ferocity for my brother, be as fierce as Fenris's storms, and sweep every enemy from our path." "Awoo, awoo, awoo," his wolf cubs answered, howls rising as they surged forward. None of them had ever seen their father so charged. After so many years apart, Russ was desperate to show his brother the wild warriors of Fenris. At his command, the fleet fanned out, heavy squadrons bracketing the flanks like the jaws of a massive wolf about to bite. The fangs were lances, macro cannons and torpedoes grinding slowly through the Randan line. The throat of that wolf was the Hrafnkill itself, swallowing any stragglers who fell behind. Under the wolves' unrelenting pursuit, the Randan were driven back, forced to yield a stretch of space as a buffer. And while Russ tore into the Xenos, Doom was far from idle. Doom held his fleet in a tight defensive formation, eyes glued to the star chart as he watched for any reinforcements or disruptors and tracked how the battlefield shifted. As the Wolves' fleet drove the Randan forces back, he began to notice something new. The Randan armada, bloated by its recent reinforcements, was showing signs of clumsiness. Command and coordination were breaking down, mistakes cropping up more often. It was like a healthy athlete suddenly carrying hundreds of extra pounds, inevitable slowdown. Humph, Doom snorted. The Randan fleet isn't as harmonious as it seems. Where the original Randan force could still contest him by sheer numbers, the newcomers had become a burden to their commanders, sapping the fleet's initiative. Good, Doom said with a pleased edge to his voice. Their thoughtless reinforcements had accidentally handed him an opening. He spread the star chart and began a new deployment. There was no reason to refuse the fat prize Randan had offered. As he finalized his battle plan, the holographic console flickered to life and Russ's imposing figure materialized in the display. Doom, the wolves are driving out the Xenos. Any new orders? Russ asked, his golden eyes catching the light like something almost divine. He was all teeth and restless eagerness, but beneath that feral surface he understood his place. The question was an offering of initiative, a ready hand extended to his brother. Doom returned the look and smiled. You run wild. I'll build an unbreakable wall. That single, simple sentence set the strategy. Doom accepted the gift of initiative Russ had given him and trusted his brother to do what he did best. Let Russ tear into the Randan fleet, sink his teeth in and refuse to let go, drive them into the maw and make it easy for the Xenos to enter, but hard for them to escape. Doom, meanwhile, would hold the line, fashioning a bulwark of attrition until the enemy had nothing left. Alrighty then, Russ grinned, flashing teeth. He understood perfectly. Kill without restraint, bite deep, do not relent. Between the two of them, that was all that needed to be said. The Primarchs required no long counsel. One exchange was enough to make their wills one. After we wipe out the Xenos, you must reward the wolf cubs. Russ insisted one last time before ending the transmission, his tone half command, half pleading. He sounded absurdly fixated on the promise, almost like a drunk for whom nothing in the galaxy could compare to a sip of good wine. Naturally, Doom replied readily. The ships carrying Nur's vintages and delicacies are already on their way. He wanted Russ's support, and he would not forget the simple, honest bargain the wolves required. Food and drink, not empty promises or political favors. Doom valued that straightforward loyalty, and he kept it close to his heart. Russ licked his lips, a hungry look flashing in his bestial eyes. He had heard tales of Nur's wines, rich, mellow, unforgettable, and the thought of tasting them made him impatient. The Space Wolves' fleet will hold the prey, he vowed, a cruel smile cutting across his face. They won't be able to escape unless they pay a price that satisfies the wolves. I look forward to the wolves' performance, Doom said, nodding. It was exactly what he meant. Since parting from Russ, he had returned to Fenris to reform the military structure and reshape the Legion's culture. He trusted his brother to do his part, and trusted the bottle waiting on the other end of it. At their reunion, Russ could hardly contain his anticipation. He wanted to see what kind of fighting force the Astartes, steeped in Fenrisian culture, would bring to the field. Just watch, he said with a knowing smile, and closed the holographic link. He brought up the Legion overview. The 13 great companies were fully organized and ready. Wolf cubs! The Primarch's low growl rolled across the Legion's comms, serving as a pre-battle rally. We are the Wolves of Fenris, the Space Marines of the Allfather. Now is the time to show our strength. Doomnavik, my closest brother, a king among the stars. Show him your ferocity. Let him inspect the fangs and claws of the pack. Russ's tone sharpened, the warm roar turning to ice. Crush Randan's pride. Let the detestable Xenos learn that mankind has never been their slave. For the Allfather. For Russ. For the Primarch. The Space Wolves answered with a fierce roar and salvos of howls. The Emperor had written the loyalty and savage strength of wolves into their genes, The hour to unleash it had come. This grand battle will bear the name of the wolves. The great wolf's howl rang out, and the pack surged forward without fear. Use wolfpack tactics, shred the Xenos screening fleet. The entire Space Wolves fleet burst from the right flank of Doom's defensive line. Under Russ's command, they swept toward the Randan reinforcements before the enemy could establish a foothold. Russ was no fool. He had studied the intelligence Doom had sent and taken into account every useful tactic. Swiftly, he arrayed the Legion and, borrowing the same rotating assault his brother had used, launched an even more aggressive strike. Led by their Primarch, the Space Marines loosed devastating force. Like a hunting pack, the wolves tested the Randan line, splitting, encircling, coordinating with ruthless precision. Lances and macro cannons bit like blades into exposed hulls, tearing at the Randan vessels and steadily sapping the enemy's combat effectiveness. The hunt was relentless, each maneuver designed to weaken the prey until it could no longer fight. Under the wolves' furious assault, Randan reacted quickly, sending ships out to counterattack the human fleet. The two Primarchs, watching from different positions, both brightened at the move. Randan's defeat suddenly looked inevitable. Rather than break off and withdraw from the Imperium's reinforcements, the Xenos commander doubled down and fought on, exactly the response the Imperium wanted. The Imperial command was anything but chaotic. The presence of two Primarchs had sharply raised morale. Their warships were few, but each one far outclassed a Randan vessel. The wolves struck the right flank with flexible, unpredictable tactics and caught the Randan reinforcement force off guard. Desperate, Randan risked sending a fleet up from around the battle moon as emergency support. Excellent. On the star chart, Randan's gambit opened a clear opportunity for Doom. First Legion Fleet. He keyed a channel to the Void Lord of the Heavenly Host and summoned the First Legion. "The Lord of the Heavenly Host is always ready," he cried, barely able to contain his excitement. The seasoned commander's instincts told him the moment for a counterattack had come. The Primarch's voice was cold and precise as he issued the order. "You will attack from the left flank. Move with the Space Wolves and execute a pincer on Randan. Relieve the Wolves' pressure, drive back Randan's lines, and deny their fleet the freedom to maneuver." "Understood, Lord Primarch," the commander replied. He straightened to attention, every inch the perfect soldier. He knew what was at stake. This was more than a tactical strike. It was a chance for the Legion to redeem itself. Chapter 198. The decisive battle approaches. The First Legion's warships massed, pressing in on the Randan left flank and forcing their enemy to hesitate in redeploying. The tide of the engagement had flipped. From the moment Primarch Lemon Russ, the Wolf King, arrived, the human fleet had shifted from passive defense to relentless offense, and the void erupted into open war. The chroniclers watched with tears in their eyes, the light of exploding vessels reflected in their wet pens as they recorded a scene no word but apocalypse could contain. Around them, moments blurred into destruction. A warship would blow apart in the blackness and let loose a dull, mournful wail. Proud capital ships that had carried hundreds of thousands of lives were ripped down to skeletons by lance beams and macro cannon salvos. Warm bodies and living histories were gone in an instant, swallowed by the void and left as grim offerings to cold metal. Blue plasma and orange lance bolts braided through the dark. Shields overloaded and collapsed like brittle shells, torpedoes punched through armor, and firestorms cascaded from wreck to wreck. There was no pause, only a relentless, heart-stopping sequence of explosions and light, each flash a funeral pyre for a world of lives. "It's so beautiful, so magnificent," the chronicler murmured, kneeling at the viewport. He leaned over his parchment and quill, as if the right word might somehow trap the sight itself. Turn this brutal hour into something worthy of memory. Russ's lip twitched. Then he bellowed to his guards, "Throw him out!" Something in that soft, awed voice set a white-hot fury burning inside the Primarch. The sacrifices of the Space Wolves, the deaths of Imperial men, reduced to beautiful and magnificent by a courtly scribe. If this was beauty, Russ thought, then no gilding, no flourish of letters, no sermonizing could make it less profane. The Wolf Guard moved like a pack. Thick hands closed on the chronicler's robe and collar and hauled him from the bridge. "No! No, no!" the robed man shrieked, fingers clawing at the glass as if he could hold on to the vista beyond. He banged his palms against the viewport and pleaded, voice breaking. "Let me see! Please, great Primarch, let me see! I must record it all. The people of the Imperium must know. Let these magnificent scenes be writ in the annals forever." Russ spat once, precise and scornful, and the spit struck the chronicler's pages. "Get him out," he snarled. "From now on, there will be no more chroniclers among the Space Wolves." A Primarch's command was not to be questioned. Within hours, chroniclers were being stripped from the ships of the Space Wolves. Those who submitted quietly were locked away under guard. The more stubborn among them were pressed into service as scribes, allowed to continue their work only under supervision. "Sir, the Randan fleet has detached ships from its rear to intercept us," the Adeptus Mechanicus advisor warned. His cogitator was linked to a divinatory array that had picked up the enemy movement. Russ waved a hand dismissively, leaning on the command console. "Don't worry about them," he said. "Doom is in charge of the grand strategy. My brother will solve this. He would never betray the Space Wolves or put us in danger." The cogitator network's servitors hummed and throbbed, feeding constant updates into the array. "The First Legion's fleet is attacking the Xenos from the left side of the stellar disk," the machines reported. "The Xenos' intercepting fleet has been forced to turn back and is now engaging the First Legion's attacking force." Russ's golden brows drew together at the new, unwelcome development. He glanced at the holoscreen, then and said sharply, "Send a message. Tell the Space Wolves to be cautious when boarding. Those Xenos warships are full of traps." When the Wolves did board the bio-warships, they paid that warning in blood. The interiors were not crewed by Randan, as one might expect, but by the Randan slave races, alien, non-human organisms that the Randan controlled and used to run the ships. They swarmed the narrow, slime-slick conduits between organs and engines, fearless and relentless, and their close-quarters fighting tore through boarding parties. Hundreds of Space Marines died fighting in those cramped tunnels. Russ made sure that intelligence was shared immediately. He fed every detail of the xenobiology and ship layout to Doom and the human task forces so allied boarding teams would not blunder into the same traps. On the command holoscreen, his large hands moved like shadows, constantly reshaping the fleet's dispositions, issuing corrections, and micromanaging maneuvers with a surgeon's focus. Compared to his first return to the Imperium, his command had hardened. His style had grown colder, more efficient, seasoned by battle. The Space Wolves clung to the Randan formation with ferocious tenacity, boarding and reboarding, grappling with the enemy fleet so that escape became all but impossible. The fight in the void stretched on. 10 hours had passed since the Wolves had thrown themselves into the fray and the First Legion had fully engaged. The battle showed no sign of ending. The First Legion, battle-hardened against the Randan, had scored notable successes on the left flank, wiping out several enemy squadrons. The Space Wolves' assault was controlled yet ferocious, cutting down 50 enemy capital ships while suffering almost no losses. Doom sat like a chess master, the unfolding battle laid out before him like a giant board. Across from him commanded the Randan Fleet Admiral. "First Fleet, advance 1 million kilometers," he ordered, sending the formation forward to pressure the Randan line. The fleet's response was immediate. He felt the Royal Majesty surge as it began its push. The ships on his side closed toward the Morse star by that measured increment. The Randan defensive screen answered in kind, moving up the same distance and altering vector as if to swing around the star. Doom's face remained calm. "Left Fleet, take up an attack posture on the star's left flank," he said, deliberately ignoring the feint. War was a contest for initiative. One could not be led about by the enemy. The Randan fleet swung immediately, angling in from the First Fleet's rear left as if to seize the opening and push on toward the planet Morse. The alien commander's intent was obvious: force the First Fleet to wheel back and defend Morse. Doom cut through the moment with a short order: full speed ahead. Objective, the Battle Moon. And the Royal Fleet's drives flared to full thrust, racing for the Battle Moon. As Doom expected, the Randan commander reacted again, pivoting his forces from the fleet's rear right to counter the new vector. Doom had enough assets to gamble. He trusted Adam to hold Morse, and was willing to risk leaving the planet to that force while he drove straight for the battle moon. The Randan leader, however, would not take that chance. The mere presence of the royal majesty over the battle moon hung over the field like a sword of Damocles, a constant threat that kept him cautious. Both sides began to treat the engagement like a high-stakes war game, feints, counters, adjustments, each shift in formation coaxing a new response from the other. On the bridge of the Hrafnkel, Russ watched the whole exchange unfold. He realized with a spark of excitement that his brother was trying something different, an unfamiliar, bold sequence of maneuvers. Russ's eyes sharpened as he tracked the fleet's subtle posture changes, studying the tactical logic behind each pull and shift, learning how the contest unfolded, not in brute force, but in movement and timing. Two simple objectives, but the tactics behind them couldn't have been more different. Russ watched the Nur and Rondan fleets as they danced in the void, pulling, probing, and feeling for weaknesses. It was a war without gunsmoke, a measured contest of maneuver, feints, and sensors. For 3 full Terran days, the fighting on the left and right flanks had burned fiercely, each engagement building toward a climax. Yet the center formations of both sides sat idle, not a single shot fired, as if disengaged from the battle altogether. "Gentlemen, we're about to launch a general assault," Doom said over the holographic channel as he finalized the last arrangements. After 3 days of attrition, the gains on the flanks had begun to diminish. The Randan were learning human tactics and adapting. Doom understood that continuing the current campaign would yield no new advantage. If the Randan judged their losses to be beyond acceptable, they would simply pull back. The only option left was to force the issue. They would have to break through the center. Decisive results would require paying a price. "The timing is right," Russ agreed. Doom's plan matched what he'd been expecting. The probing was over. Now it was time to commit and finish the job. War had never been bloodless. His brother had done everything he could, grinding the Randan down to the last reserves of their strength. Doom steadied himself and kept his composure before the assembled commanders. "Yes," he said, voice measured. "The Randan will not be able to send more fleets. They've already committed more to this war than they'd intended. They're likely weighing withdrawal now, to spare themselves greater losses," another officer observed. Grandmaster Urian's jaw tightened. He would not let the spirit of the First Legion falter in front of the 2 Primarchs. "Sir," he said abruptly, "to hold the Xenos in place, the First Legion is ready to charge first. Only that will prevent them from escaping." Doom inclined his head. His gaze swept past Urian and settled on the Lord of the Heavenly Host displayed in holographic projection. "Only through sacrifice can we inflict real damage on the Xenos," he said. The Lord's hologram bowed low. "I obey your command. The First Legion will not bring shame upon you." Doom nodded, solemn. He glanced at Russ, his brother, another Primarch who had seen as much of war's cruelty as he had. He opened his mouth as if to say more, then stopped. Words were unnecessary. Russ understood. Without them, the cost they were about to ask of their men. A worthy death. Doom said nothing more, the 3 words carrying the same meaning they'd shared aboard the Vengeful Spirit. Russ gave a heavy nod, then let his face relax into a crooked smile. "Don't forget your promise." "Of course not." The weight between them evaporated. Doom snorted with a laugh. "Trying to outdrink me again? You just wait." Russ's eyes flashed as he remembered his last defeat. He jabbed a finger at Doom's hologram. "This time I'll drink you under the table." Doom's mouth twisted in a scornful smirk, and he spread his hands as if to show he looked down on it all. "I fear nothing." Russ grinned and then abruptly severed the link. Doom's expression locked back into steel. "Notify the fleet. General assault on the Randan. All forces attack!"